The story begins not with noise, but with silence. Imagine the world before the written word, before cities rose from stone, before kings built thrones and armies marched across the earth. In that silence, when humanity was still learning the shape of its own voice, a hand reached out in the dark of a cave and carved something into the wall. It was not an animal, though animals were everywhere. It was not a face, though the world was filled with faces. It was a mark, a symbol, etched by firelight, seen by trembling eyes, and remembered for reasons we can no longer ask. That same mark would appear again and again. On rocks by the river, on clay tablets buried under forgotten sands, on temple, pillars still standing after 10,000 years of wind. It would be worn as amulets on the dead, burned into wood, whispered in prayer and drawn by children in dust. And the strangest truth is this: no matter where we look, in cultures separated by oceans, by centuries, by every possible barrier of distance and language, the mark is the same. How could this be? How could people who never met, who never traded, a word or a story, draw the same thing, hold the same fear, guard the same secret? Was it accident, coincidence, or something deeper, buried in the mind we all share? The question lingers, like smoke twisting in a still room. Symbols are more than shapes. They are bridges, links between the visible and the invisible, between thought and the world outside thought. A circle is not just a circle. It becomes the sun, the eye, eternity. A line is not just a line. It becomes boundary, path, barrier. But this particular symbol, the one that rises like a ghost in every culture, seems to carry weight beyond simple imagination. It does not explain itself, yet it demands attention. It was carved and feared, worshipped and forbidden, repeated and traced, and yet it survives, etched into our collective story like a heartbeat. Perhaps it was born from nature itself, some form seen in the turn of rivers, in the branches of trees, in the spirals of shells or the fires of stars. Perhaps it arose from dreams, a pattern the sleeping mind could not resist drawing when daylight returned. Or perhaps more chillingly it was taught, not by people, not by wandering traders, but by something older, something that walked with humanity long before memory was written down. Tonight, we step into that mystery. The camera wanders, slowly through a cave where flickering light catches scratched markings. We imagine a world where every night was dangerous, where shadows were alive, and the symbol was not art but shield. A hand reaching from 40,000 years ago whispers across time. This meant something. We follow the mark forward, across deserts, where the Sumerians built cities, into the temples of Egypt where priests feared its power, into the hidden chambers of Greece where philosophers debated but would not speak its name. We find it cut into Norse runestones, folded into Asian mandalas, carved on Mayan temples, hidden in medieval cathedrals, scribbled in the notebooks of alchemists, raised on banners in war, and still, in some quiet corners of the world, drawn by hands that never learned where it came from. The symbol is always the same, its story always different, its presence always unsettling. Why does it persist? Why does the human mind return to it as if pulled by gravity? Could it be instinct? Like the way we fear the dark or the way we dream of flight? Could it be that the symbol comes not from culture, but from the architecture of the mind itself? If so, then it belongs not to Egypt or Greece or China or the Maya. It belongs to all of us, written in a script older than history. And yet, if it is ours, why do we fear it? Cultures did not draw this mark with joy. They inscribed it with trembling hands, or they outlawed it, or they whispered warnings of its danger. Priests used it to summon gods, but peasants avoided it as a curse. Kings wore it on crowns, but banned commoners from drawing it in the dirt. Something in the symbol terrified as much as it fascinated. It was as if people knew instinctively that it was more than a shape, that it was a key, and keys do not exist without doors. But what door did it open? The film begins here in this quiet question, the hush before the journey. We do not rush toward answers. Instead, we drift slowly, like a traveler walking through ruins at night. We will step carefully through time and space, following the mark wherever it appears, asking again and again, what did people see in this shape? Why did they guard it so fiercely? And why does it still surface, even now, in places where no history explains its presence? We are not searching for a neat conclusion. Mysteries like this do not end with clarity, they end with awe. What we search for is a pattern, an echo, a feeling, a recognition that when we look at this ancient mark, we are not simply looking at something others created, we are looking at something we too carry within us. The symbol is a mirror. It reflects humanity back at itself, across centuries, across continents, across forgotten languages and lost empires. And as we walk into this story, we must remember, to see the symbol is to join a chain of recognition stretching back to the very first hand that carved it in stone. So, let the lights dim, let the world outside grow quiet, and let us step into the darkness together. There is a story waiting there, a story of lines and curves, of fear and fascination, of whispers and echoes that never seem to die. It is the story of a mark that every culture made and every culture feared. And it begins here, in silence, with a single question. Why would every culture create the same symbol? And why across every age did they fear its power? There are places in the world where silence feels older than time. Step into the mouth of a cave and you sense it, the hush, the stillness, the weight of ages pressing down like invisible hands. The walls are damp, glistening with mineral, tears, the air cool and heavy. Each footstep echoes as though someone or something is answering from deeper within. In such a place, tens of thousands of years ago, a human hand reached out to stone. With a shard of flint or bone, that hand carved a line, then another, until a shape emerged. Not a picture of the hunt, not the likeness of a deer or bison, not a simple mark of territory, but something stranger, something abstract, something that did not belong to the animal world outside, but to the unseen world within. This was the birth of the first symbol. Archaeologists have long puzzled over these markings. Deep in caves like Chauvet in France or Altamira in Spain, we find paintings of animals so vivid they seem to breathe when lit by fire. But tucked among these great herds are smaller carvings, quieter marks, spirals, crosses, repeating lines, grids. They appear almost careless, yet always deliberate, and among them again and again is one particular shape, repeated across thousands of miles, in caves that no culture shared. Why would hunters, whose lives depended on food and survival, spend precious hours scratching these signs into stone? Perhaps they were not just hunters. Perhaps they were something more, the first storytellers, the first dreamers, the first to feel that the world was larger than what eyes could see. The Paleolithic cave was no ordinary place. Imagine the darkness, unbroken except for flickering fire. Imagine the smell of smoke, the muffled drip of water, the whisper of wind through narrow cracks. To enter a cave was to step into another realm, a place where echoes transformed whispers into voices. It was easy in such a space to believe you were not alone. When a mark was carved there, it was not idle. It was a communication, a message, to forces both feared and revered. Some scholars believe these symbols were tallies, the first mathematics, counts of animals, of seasons, of moons. Others argue they were charms, prayers carved into the wall to summon good fortune or ward off danger. Still others whisper that they were warnings, left for those who would come later. Beware this place, beware what dwells in the dark. Each theory explains part of the story, but none explains why the same mark appears everywhere, in caves separated by thousands of miles, carved by people who never met. Consider the world of these early humans. Life was precarious, death was close, and every night brought shadows filled with mystery. The hunt might fail, storms might rage, predators might stalk the camp. In such a world, patterns mattered. A hunter who noticed the curve of hoof prints in mud or the spiral of smoke rising into the air might see meaning in repetition, and perhaps when they dreamed, they saw shapes repeating in the theater of the mind, shapes they felt compelled to bring back into daylight by carving them into stone. The first carvings, then, were not idle art. They were attempts at control. To carve was to bind the unseen, to pin it in place, to give it form. The symbol was both a weapon and a shield. It was a way of saying, I see you, I name you, I make you real. And in making it real, perhaps, they believed they could control. Yet if the symbol gave comfort, it also inspired fear. To carve something is to invite it. To draw the unseen is to summon it. Early humans may have believed that their markings were doors, openings between the ordinary world and the world of spirits. Some doors are safe to open, others are not. And so, while the animals painted on cave walls might represent sustenance or celebration, the stranger symbols may have carried warnings, like a whispered prayer never meant to be spoken aloud. When we look at these marks today with electric lights and modern eyes, we often miss their weight. We call them abstract or geometric, reducing them to categories of thought. But imagine them by torchlight, flickering in the dark, shadows making them writhe on the walls. Imagine a shaman chanting before them, or a hunter kneeling asking for strength, or a mother pressing her hand against the stone as though the mark itself could guard her child. In those moments, the symbol was not abstract, it was alive. One cave in particular holds a haunting example. In southern France, deep within a passage almost impossible to reach, archaeologists found a wall covered in strange markings. No animals, no humans, only symbols, spirals, grids, lines, and that repeating shape, drawn again and again as though its power had to be multiplied. Why carve it so far from daylight, in a place so difficult to enter? The answer may be simple, because this was no art gallery. This was a sanctuary, or perhaps a prison, a place where something was contained by stone. The first carvings in stone were not only for the living, they were for the dead. Burial sites from the Paleolithic show the same symbols scratched onto, stones placed with bodies. Were they guides for the spirit, warnings to whatever waited in the afterlife, or seals meant to keep something from following the dead into eternity? We cannot know. But the repetition tells us this. These symbols mattered enough to carry across generations. They were not random doodles, they were legacy. As centuries passed, the carvings spread. In Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in places so far apart, no meeting. Was possible the same shapes emerged. Some believe this proves human minds share a common architecture, that we dream the same patterns, imagine the same fears. Others wonder if stories traveled farther than we think, passed from tribe to tribe, whispered along trails of migration. But still, one possibility lingers in the shadows. Perhaps these marks were not created at all. Perhaps they were discovered. Like constellations already burning in the sky, waiting for someone to notice. The caves are quiet now. The fires are long dead, the hunters gone. Only the stone remains, carrying the echoes of hands that trembled as they carved. When we place our own hands on those carvings, when we trace the grooves with our fingers, we are touching the oldest conversation humanity ever had with itself. We are listening to the first voice of fear and awe. And in that voice we hear a question that has never gone away. What lies beyond the world we see? The first carvings in stone remind us that humanity has always lived in two worlds, the world of survival and the world of meaning. Food, shelter, fire, these kept bodies alive. But symbols kept souls alive. They gave shape to the invisible. They made sense of the senseless. They offered control in a world of chaos. And though the hunters who carved them are gone, their marks remain stubborn as memory, etched into the oldest skin of the earth. As we leave the caves behind, the echoes of those carvings follow us. They linger in our minds, strange and familiar. All at once, the symbol that began in darkness will not stay there. It will travel forward, carried by whispers, carried by migrations, carried by memory. From the caves of Europe and Africa, it will drift into the deserts of Mesopotamia, where it will take on new life, new fear, new meaning. The stone walls fade, the dripping caves dissolve, and in their place we see the rising sun over endless sand. The rivers of Mesopotamia glisten in the dawn, and carved into the clay tablets of scribes, etched into the thresholds of temples, the same symbol appears again, older now, heavier, carrying with it not just mystery but power. The journey continues. The caves fade into light. The flicker of torches and the dripping of stone dissolve, and in their place rises the vast and burning horizon of the desert. The air is no longer damp and cool, but hot, dry and shimmering with heat. The world has changed. Humanity has stepped from the shadows of stone chambers into the brilliance of the open sky. Here, in the valleys of Mesopotamia and along the fertile floodplains of the Nile, the symbol carved in darkness does not vanish. It reappears, brighter now, written in clay and ink, carved into temple walls, etched onto the edges of boundary stones, woven into the rituals of priests who believed themselves keepers of the cosmos. If the caves were the cradle of imagination, then Mesopotamia and Egypt were its first great stage. It was here that humanity learned to harness the river, to build cities, to summon kings and armies, and, most importantly, to write. And when writing was born, it did not appear as neutral letters or numbers. It was entwined with the sacred, tangled with myth, heavy with fear. Among the earliest tablets of Sumer and Akkad, among the hieroglyphs of Egypt, the mysterious symbol, once carved by trembling hunters, returned, transformed into a mark charged with divine significance. In Mesopotamia, the scribes were the keepers of knowledge. With stylus and clay, they pressed the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform, recording not only trade and taxes, but prayers, omens, and curses. The clay tablets, baked in kilns or hardened by the sun, carried the weight of permanence. To write something was to fix it in time, to make it endure long after the breath that spoke it had faded. The symbol, when inscribed, became more than a line on stone. It became a command to the world itself. Boundary stones known as kuduru tell us this story well. These stones marked the limits of land, but they were not simply practical markers. They were talismans inscribed with curses for anyone who dared to move them. Alongside the names of kings and the shapes of gods, the recurring mark appears, always, associated with authority, always linked to divine wrath. To carve it into a stone was to call down the judgment of heaven against those who defied the rightful order. A shape that may once have been a whisper in caves now became a tool of law and power. Priests, too, carried the symbol into their rituals. It was painted onto altars, traced in ash, drawn on the ground in sacred spaces where common people were forbidden. The Sumerians believed the cosmos was fragile, a balance easily broken. Night could overwhelm day. Chaos could swallow order. Demons could slip into the world unless guarded against. To maintain harmony, priests recited long incantations, and often at their climax, the forbidden mark was drawn, sometimes in the air with a wand, sometimes on the ground, sometimes on the body of the sacrificial animal. It was a seal, a barrier, a key that locked the invisible in its place. And yet the symbol was not only feared, it was revered. In some texts, it is linked to the moon, the great counterweight to the burning sun. The Mesopotamians saw in its form a mirror of the heavens, the cycles of time, the rise and fall of celestial bodies. To draw it was to align oneself with the cosmic order. To misuse it was to invite collapse. Thus, it lived in the tension between blessing and curse, promise and peril. Across the desert, in the land of the Nile, Egypt gave the symbol new life. The Egyptians were masters of symbolism. Their entire written language, hieroglyphs, was a tapestry of pictures carrying layers of meaning. Here, the mysterious mark found its place alongside the eye of Horus, the Ankh, the scarab. It appeared on papyrus scrolls carried by priests, scratched into ostraca, carved onto tomb walls where only the dead and the gods could read them. In Egypt, the symbol became especially tied to the journey of the soul. Death was not an end, but a passage, and the Book of the Dead was filled with spells, charms, and incantations to guide the departed. Among these incantations, the recurring mark served as both guidepost and barrier, ensuring that the soul crossed into the afterlife safely and that no malevolent force could follow. To inscribe it was to light a lamp in the darkness of death. But lamps also cast shadows, and the same sign was feared as a beacon to those who might wish to follow the soul where it did not belong. Pharaohs had it carved into sarcophagi, sometimes hidden where no ordinary eye would see. To outsiders, the tomb seemed only a monument of wealth. To the initiated, the markings were weapons, lines of defense against curses, spirits, and intruders. The very act of drawing it was considered dangerous. Some scribes refused unless purified, and some priests performed rituals of cleansing after handling it. To mark it casually was to risk drawing the attention of forces best left undisturbed. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, writing itself was understood as magical. The word was not separate from the thing it described. To write the name of a god was to summon its presence. To write the name of an enemy was to curse them. In such a world, the recurring symbol could never be just a mark. It was alive, vibrating with unseen energy. Every stroke of the stylus, or reed pen, was both art and invocation. Why did both these great civilizations, rising independently along rivers, separated by deserts and distance, arrive at the same mark? Scholars debate this fiercely. Was it trade, ideas drifting along caravan routes? Was it coincidence, geometry repeating itself in the human mind? Or was it, as some ancient scribes whispered, a truth handed down from before memory, from the gods themselves? The Egyptians spoke of a time before time, a golden age when divine beings walked among men. The Mesopotamians told of knowledge descending from the heavens, gifts from mysterious watchers. Could the symbol have been one of those gifts, its meaning diluted but never erased? The tone of this age was different from the Paleolithic caves. The hunters carved in mystery and fear of the unseen. But here, in temples and palaces, the symbol became bound to institutions of power. It was no longer the property of the people, but of the priesthood, of the scribes, of the kings who claimed divine right. To draw it without permission was dangerous. To invoke it outside of ritual was heresy. It was guarded like fire, used to light the world but feared for the destruction it could bring. And so in both lands, the symbol became part of the architecture of civilization itself. On the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris, on the fertile strip of the Nile, it was carried forward in clay and papyrus, in stone and ink. It was a seal of authority, a guide for the soul, a weapon against chaos, and a forbidden key to mysteries whispered only among initiates. Even today, archaeologists uncover fragments. A broken tablet here, a shard of pottery there, a faint carving on the side of a ruined temple. And still, the mark stares back at us, sharp and familiar, the same shape carved in caves, now codified into writing, tied to gods of sun and moon, bound to rituals we can only half understand. As the centuries pass in this story, the rivers of Mesopotamia flow on. The Nile rises and falls with its floods, and the symbol travels further still. Across the Mediterranean, across seas and mountains, it will appear again, reborn in myths of labyrinths, whispered in Greek mysteries hidden in pottery and stone. The desert sun sets. The papyrus scrolls curl in the hands of priests. The tablets rest in archives where no one reads them anymore. Slowly, the sound of rushing water fades. The great rivers dim. And in their place, another horizon emerges. The glittering blue of the Aegean Sea, where myths and philosophy wait, ready to inherit the old sign and dress it in new riddles. The waters of the Aegean ripple into view, sparkling beneath a merciless sun. The temples of Egypt fade behind us, the reed pens and clay tablets left in silence. A new world rises, carved of white stone and salt air, where myth and philosophy intermingle, and where gods stride among mortals in stories so powerful they refuse to fade. Greece, the land of oracles, poets, and philosophers, becomes the next stage in the journey of the ancient mark. Yet here the symbol grows more elusive, concealed not in plain boundary stones or scrolls, but woven into riddles, hidden in painted pottery, and veiled in the whispers of secret cults. It is in Greece that the symbol first becomes a labyrinth. On the island of Crete, legend tells of King Minos, who commanded the master craftsman Daedalus to construct a maze so cunning, so tangled, that no prisoner could escape its winding turns. Within it lurked the Minotaur, half-man, half-beast, the shame of a cursed bloodline and the terror of Athens. Each year, young men and women were sent to the labyrinth, never to return. Only Theseus, guided by Ariadne's thread, dared enter and find his way back. The myth is one of heroism and sacrifice, yet beneath it lies the shadow of something deeper. Archaeologists studying the ruins of Knossos have found markings etched into the stone floors and painted on fragments of pottery. Amid the spirals and double-headed axes, the labries, appears a familiar sign, hauntingly similar to the mark carried from the caves through Mesopotamia and along the Nile. To the Minoans, the labyrinth was not merely a prison. It was a mirror of the cosmos, a place where the initiate wandered through confusion, darkness, and terror, only to emerge changed. The symbol carved into its walls was not a decoration, but a key. To step into the maze was to step into mystery, and only those who understood the hidden meaning of the sign could hope to return whole. The labyrinth, both physical and spiritual, was a threshold between worlds. Later Greeks inherited these fragments of Cretan ritual and cloaked them in myth. They spoke of Ariadne not simply as a princess, but as a priestess, keeper of secrets, her thread less a tool of escape and more a lifeline to divine truth. The mark painted at the heart of the labyrinth was both a curse and a guide, a map not of stone corridors, but of the soul's journey through life, death, and what lay beyond. To reveal such meaning too openly would be to break the boundary between human and divine, a boundary the Greeks feared to cross. Beyond Crete, the symbol appears in other corners of Greece, woven into the artistry of daily life. On pottery shards, excavated from Attica, faint designs emerge. Amid depictions of banquets, gods, and battles, there it is, scratched lightly, almost hidden, as if the artist dared not place it in full view. In geometric patterns decorating amphorae, it reappears, half buried among meanders and spirals. Some scholars argue it was only ornament, the hand of an artisan repeating familiar forms. But the frequency, the precision, the subtle isolation of the mark within the design suggests something more deliberate. It was a whisper on clay, a sign passed quietly from one set of hands to another. Even more telling is its presence in the teachings of the mystery cults. Greece was full of open religion, temples, sacrifices, festivals where gods were praised, before all. But beneath this public faith lay hidden currents, the Eleusinian mysteries, the cult of Dionysus, the Orphic rites. These were not shouted from the steps of the Parthenon, they were whispered in caves, carried out in torchlit processions, guarded by oaths so severe that to break them was to invite death. Within these mysteries, initiates were taught truths not meant for the unprepared, truths about death, rebirth, and the soul's hidden path. The symbol, we are told, was part of these rituals. In Eleusis, where Demeter and Persephone's story of descent and return was reenacted, initiates saw images that were never described outside the sanctuary. Ancient writers speak of a sacred object, revealed at the climax of the ceremony, something so overwhelming it changed the initiate forever. Was it the mark? We cannot know, for none dared to record it plainly. But fragments of testimony, hints, in Plato, in Pindar, in late Roman commentators, suggest that a sign ancient and forbidden was traced or displayed, embodying the eternal cycle of death and return. In the Orphic traditions, the symbol is even more veiled. Orphic gold tablets buried with the dead carry cryptic instructions. Say, I am a child of earth and starry heaven. I have drunk the milk of memory. The letters are scattered with strange markings, some matching the ancient sign. Here it was not a boundary stone or a charm, but a password, something the soul would present at the gates of the afterlife. To know it was to gain safe passage. To forget it was to be cast back into the cycle of rebirth. The mark had become not only sacred but salvific, a secret key to eternity. Why then did philosophers hint but never say? Socrates, Plato, even Pythagoras, all circled around mysteries they refused to name. Plato in particular wrote of forms and symbols, of truth hidden beyond shadows, of knowledge remembered rather than learned. At times, he described sacred diagrams, divine figures that the soul must contemplate to approach truth. He never drew them. He never described them directly. Why? Perhaps because they were part of the mysteries, guarded by death oaths. Perhaps because to reveal them would invite divine wrath. Or perhaps because, even for Plato, words and drawings could not capture what the mark represented. To speak it was to diminish it. To draw it was to risk unleashing it. The silence of the philosophers is as telling as their words. They lived in a culture that valued reason and debate, yet when it came to this mark, they fell silent. Pythagoras spoke of numbers, geometry, and harmony, yet hinted at shapes of profound danger. His followers swore secrecy, and some accounts say initiates were shown a diagram never revealed to outsiders. Those who broke the silence were banished. The mark lived not on public scrolls, but in the guarded space between lips, sealed shut. To the Greeks, then, the symbol was both an inheritance and a threat. It had traveled from Crete, where it was carved into labyrinth walls, into Athens, where it was painted on pottery, into the sanctuaries of Eleusis and Dionysus, where it was carried in torchlit nights. It had become a sign of transformation, of journeys through darkness, of knowledge forbidden to the uninitiated. Above all, it had become dangerous. To know it was power, to speak it was peril, and so its presence in Greece is more ghost than body. We see fragments, hints, shadows. We hear whispers in myths and riddles in philosophy. We glimpse it in the twist of a labyrinth, in the spirals of amphorae, in the secretive silence of Socrates. It is there but never fully revealed, as if the Greeks themselves feared what might happen if the mark were exposed to full daylight. Perhaps this is why the labyrinth itself became the perfect metaphor. A twisting path, walls that conceal, a truth hidden at the center that only the brave or the doomed could reach. The symbol was the heart of the maze, alluring, terrifying, transformative, and those who found it rarely emerged unchanged. The Aegean waves crash against the shore, the philosophers fall silent. The torchlight of Eleusis fades into darkness. Greece, with its myths and mysteries, passes into history, yet the symbol does not fade. It travels still, carried in whispers and secret signs, following the roads of conquest, trade, and empire. Soon, the eagle of Rome will rise, and with it, a new chapter will begin. The whispers of Greece fade into the iron footsteps of Rome's empire. The footsteps of Greece echo into silence, and in their place comes the heavy tread of legionnaires. The world changes. White marble temples remain, the myths endure, the philosophies are copied, but they are no longer purely Greek. They are Roman now, absorbed into an empire that swallows cultures whole and remakes them in its own image. Where Greece had whispered its mysteries, Rome shouts with power, order, and conquest. Yet amid the laws and legions, the old mark resurfaces. It does not fade. Instead, it is reborn, etched into shields, traced on altars, feared in the Senate, and outlawed by decree. The Romans inherited much from the Greeks, their gods, their architecture, their stories, but the Romans were practical people. Where the Greeks sought meaning in philosophy, the Romans demanded utility. They valued what could protect, what could command victory, what could secure power. And so, when whispers of the ancient symbol reached them, through pottery, through scrolls, through the scattered remnants of Greek cults, they did not treat it only as a riddle. They gave it a place on the battlefield, in the forum, and in the rituals of state. The mark gained muscle. The first clear traces come from soldiers. Roman legionnaires, hardened men who marched across continents, carried more than spears and shields. They carried charms, amulets, carved stones marked with signs meant to guard against death. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of shields and helmets scratched with symbols, suns, spirals, crossed lines, and among them, the familiar ancient mark. Was it drawn in faith or superstition? A soldier facing battle with only his shield between him and the enemy had little use for philosophy. He wanted protection, and the mark promised strength. Some etched it onto the inside of shields where only they would see it. Others painted it boldly on the front, daring the enemy to face not only Rome, but whatever unseen power the symbol invoked. Legends from the legions tell of battles where standards fell, yet companies that carried the mark fought on with unnatural resolve. Stories spread among camps that the sign could turn a blade aside, confuse the enemy, or call down divine favor. The line between truth and rumor blurred, but in war, belief itself was a weapon. If soldiers thought the mark gave them strength, they fought as if it did. And so the symbol became entwined with Roman military might, its presence both psychological and sacred. Yet it was not only soldiers who embraced it. Priests, augurs, and keepers of Rome's many cults also traced the mark in their rites. The Romans were masters of ritual, believing that proper ceremony maintained the favor of the gods and the stability of the state. Within the smoke of sacrifices and the mutter of incantations, certain priests began to use the mark as a binding sign, a way of sealing prayers, warding off ill omens, or invoking protection. Inscriptions from the early empire include strange repetitions of the symbol alongside the names of gods. On boundary stones, it appeared once more, echoing its role in Mesopotamia and Egypt. But here, in Rome, it gained a double life, both official and outlawed, both sacred and feared. For just as some embraced it, others recoiled. The Romans, pragmatic as they were, distrusted what they could not control. The Senate tolerated many cults, absorbing foreign gods and rituals into the vast Roman pantheon. But the symbol was different. It was too old, too mysterious, too untraceable in origin. Unlike Jupiter or Mars, it belonged to no clear myth, no well-ordered story. It hovered on the edge of religion and sorcery, a mark without pedigree. Some believed it called not divine favor, but divine wrath. In times of crisis, this fear sharpened. During plagues, famines, or defeats in war, whispers grew that the forbidden mark had been invoked wrongly, that it had stirred forces Rome could not master. Decrees were passed outlawing its use. Those found inscribing it could face exile or worse. The irony was stark. The same mark painted proudly on shields could, in another context, be denounced as dangerous magic. Soldiers carried it for strength, but senators condemned it as superstition. Priests traced it in secret, while magistrates forbade it in public. Rome lived in tension with the sign, both wielding it and fearing it, both honoring and outlawing it. The contradictions only deepened as Rome expanded. In the far provinces, Gaul, Britannia, Germania, legionnaires carved the mark onto fort walls and milestones. Local tribes noticed. Some adopted it, blending it with their own spirals, knots, and sigils. Others rejected it, seeing in it the emblem of conquest and foreign domination. Thus the mark spread not only as mystery, but as imperial symbol, entwined with Rome's presence across the known world. Philosophers and historians of the empire took note, but carefully. Pliny the Elder, cataloguing natural wonders and human customs, mentioned strange protective signs used by soldiers and peasants alike, though he never drew them plainly. Cicero, skeptical of superstition, warned that Rome's greatness lay not in charms but in law and reason. Yet beneath such rational words, the mark persisted, too common to erase, too powerful to name outright. And in the underground of Rome, in the hidden shrines and nocturnal gatherings, the mark took on yet another life. Mystery religions from the East, Mithras, Isis, Cybele, flourished in Rome's shadows. Their initiates carried tokens and secret diagrams, many of which incorporated or echoed the forbidden sign. To these followers, it was not a danger, but a promise, a guide through the chaos of life toward hidden truth. They painted it on the walls of catacombs, scratched it into the underside of altars, and whispered it in rituals sworn to secrecy. For them, the mark was not forbidden but sacred, its danger part of its power. This duality, sacred and forbidden, soldier's charm and senator's nightmare, gave the symbol a strange vitality in Rome. Unlike the orderly gods of the state, it lived in contradiction. It was both Rome's weapon and Rome's curse, and perhaps that is why it endured. Over time, fear of the mark deepened. Certain emperors, eager to project control, banned it outright. Rumors swirled that those who bore it invited disaster. Crops failing, ships sinking, storms rising. Even so, soldiers still scratched it onto their gear. Slaves still carved it into hidden corners of villas. Farmers still pressed it into clay as they sealed their grain. No decree could kill it, for belief in its power outlasted fear of punishment. As Rome's empire began to fracture under the weight of its own ambitions, the symbol became entangled with prophecy. Some claimed it foretold Rome's downfall. In Sibylline oracles and apocalyptic poems, writers spoke of a mark that would undo empires, a sign both older and stronger than Rome itself. Such prophecies made the Senate uneasy. To speak of Rome's end was treason. To connect it with the forbidden mark was heresy. And yet the stories spread, whispered in taverns, carried in legions, murmured in marketplaces. When Christianity rose from obscurity to dominance, the fate of the symbol grew even more complex. Some early Christians, themselves heirs of Jewish traditions of sacred writing and forbidden names, saw echoes of divine truth in it. Others condemned it as pagan sorcery. In catacombs beneath Rome, symbols overlap. Crosses, fish, anchors, and faint traces of the ancient mark, layered like palimpsests of belief. Was it adopted, transformed, or buried? The answer is unclear, but its presence cannot be denied. Even as new faiths rose, the old sign refused to die. By the time Rome stumbled into decline, barbarians pressing at borders, generals usurping emperors, the Senate losing its grip, the mark had become a paradox too entangled to resolve. It was loved and hated, carved and erased, carried proudly, and hidden away. For centuries it had been Rome's shadow companion, visible on shields and hidden in scrolls, traced in prayer and banned in law. And when the empire finally began to fall, the sign did not collapse with it. Instead it slipped away, carried northward by wandering tribes, by missionaries and refugees, by soldiers who abandoned their posts and returned to their homelands with scraps of Roman culture. In the forests of Germania, in the misty isles of Britannia, in the wildlands of Gaul, the mark reappeared, fused with local symbols of storm and stone. Rome fell, but the forbidden mark endured. The eagles of the empire crumble into dust, the marble temples crack, the legions vanish into memory. Yet in the twilight of Rome's fall, the sign remains, flickering like an ember carried into the darkness. For beyond the ruins of the Mediterranean world lie new shadows, lands of forests, mists, and forgotten gods, where the mark will take on yet another life. The empire collapses, and shadows rise in the north. The empire of Rome sinks into ruin. Its marble crumbles, its legions vanish, its laws scatter like dust across the wind. But the mark, older than Rome, older than Greece, does not vanish. It drifts, carried in whispers, in carvings, in fragments of memory. And in the cold wild lands of the north, where frost clings to stones and storms rule the seas, it is born again. Here among fjords and frozen forests, among long nights and brief burning days, the Norse carved their stories into stone. They carved their prayers, their boasts, their victories, their grief. They carved runes. The world of the Vikings was written in these strange angular letters, straight lines fit for wood and rock, cut deep so that no time, no weather could easily erase them. Among these runes, scattered across burial stones and standing pillars, the ancient mark reappears. Not named, not explained, yet there, unmistakable. Some say it was brought north by wandering traders, soldiers who had once served Rome, refugees carrying charms and amulets. Others claim it was always here, as old as the mountains and seas themselves. Whatever its path, by the time the sagas were spoken and the stones were raised, the symbol had taken root in Viking belief. The Norse were a people of contradictions, fierce in battle, yet deeply bound to fate. They believed in Norns who wove the threads of destiny, in gods who strode between worlds, in signs carved into wood that could bend the outcome of war. To them, symbols had power, not as idle marks, but as weapons of spirit. Rune stones across Sweden and Denmark bear not only names and stories, but protective signs, sharp-angled charms designed to shield the dead or strengthen the living. And among them lies the forbidden mark, carved beside runes of Odin's name, Thor's hammer, or prayers for safe passage. On ships the mark appeared on carved prows, snarling beasts with lines etched into their flanks. When longships cut across the icy seas, the symbol rode with them, carved into wood that bit the waves. To carve it was to invoke both courage and risk. Sailors whispered that the mark could call the wind, could steady the oars, could blind an enemy fleet in mist. But they also warned that to misuse it was to invite disaster. Storms so sudden no sail could stand, madness that seized the crew, visions that led men to leap into the sea. Gift and curse, strength and ruin, it carried both. The sagas themselves passed down by skalds in long halls lit with fire, tell fragments of its story. They do not name it outright, for to name was to bind, and the Norse feared binding what could not be bound. Yet in their verses, warriors speak of a carved line that turned aside blades, a charm that made a berserker unstoppable, a sign that led one chieftain to victory while driving another to madness. It is always there, lurking in the poetry, never fully revealed, like a shadow in the firelight. Consider the berserkers, those wild fighters who donned wolf skins or bear pelts, who howled and charged without fear. Some accounts say they carried charms scratched with the mark. To them it was no symbol of order, but of unleashed fury. It opened them to the storm inside, to the madness that made them fight beyond pain, beyond fear. But that same madness could consume them. Some returned from battle unable to speak, eyes vacant, lost to the frenzy. The mark did not give freely. It demanded a price. Priests of Odin, keepers of secret runes, also traced the mark in ritual. They painted it with blood, upon wood, whispering over sacrifices. To them it was not only a charm of war but a doorway. For Odin himself, the god of wisdom and war, was a seeker of signs. He had hung upon Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 nights, pierced by a spear to win the knowledge of runes. Symbols were sacred to him, keys to unseen power. And so, in his cult, the forbidden mark may have been seen as one of the deepest mysteries, a shard of knowledge too sharp to hold. But just as with Rome, suspicion followed the symbol. Some chieftains outlawed its use, declaring that it brought more ruin than victory. They claimed whole villages had fallen to madness after its carving, that ships carrying it had vanished without trace. Others embraced it, carving it boldly into stones as if daring fate itself. This tension, the same mark feared and honored, was as strong in the Viking world as it had been in Rome. The archaeological record bears strange testimony. On certain runestones, the mark is carved beside invocations that curse any who disturb the grave. Whoever breaks this stone, let him be broken by the gods. Beside such curses, the forbidden sign looms like a seal, a final threat. On others it stands alone, as if no words were needed, just the mark itself carrying a weight beyond language. In charms, too, it lived. Small pieces of bone or iron have been found, scratched with runes and strange signs, meant to be carried in pockets or hung around necks. Warriors bore them into battle, farmers kept them for luck, sailors tied them to their ships. Always the mark hovered between hope and danger. A charm to one man was a curse to another. The wildness of the North magnified this tension. Unlike the ordered empire of Rome, the Norse world was a patchwork of clans and kingdoms, bound by shifting alliances and endless feuds. Fate to them was a storm, unpredictable, inevitable, to be ridden but never mastered. In such a world, a symbol that promised both victory and ruin fit naturally. It was the image of their lives, sharp, dangerous, balanced on the edge of chaos. The skalds wove the mark into their imagery of storms and steel. In their poetry, swords sang, shields cracked, and the sea roared with living voice. Amid this chaos, the mark appeared like lightning, sudden, dazzling, terrifying. He bore the sign that no man should bear, one saga hints, and so he won, but so he was lost. Always victory came with a shadow, triumph with a cost. As Christianity began to creep into the north, brought by missionaries and monks, the fate of the mark shifted once more. Some priests condemned it as heathen magic, tied to Odin's blood and Thor's hammer. Yet others, more cautious, saw in it echoes of their own cross, their own sacred geometry. In certain carvings, the two symbols seemed to overlap, as if the forbidden mark and the Christian cross momentarily fused, neither fully erased. But the old stories lingered. Even as churches rose on hilltops, the symbol endured in hidden corners, scratched into wood beams, etched into rings, whispered in charms. It was too deeply tied to storm and steel to vanish quickly. For centuries it remained, straddling the line between pagan past and Christian future. In the end, the Vikings themselves passed into legend. Their ships ceased to prowl the seas. Their sagas were written down by foreign hands. Their gods faded into myth. Yet the mark endured, carved deep into stone, waiting in the frost. For in the north, nothing truly dies. The past is buried in ice, preserved for centuries, ready to return. And so the forbidden sign lingered, waiting for the next journey. Beyond the fjords and forests, beyond the icy seas, another world awaited. A world of silk and paper, of dragons and dynasties, of ancient philosophies and vast empires. The winds that carried Viking ships also carried their stories eastward, across the steppes and seas, into the heart of Asia. The icy seas drift toward Asian shores. The frozen seas of the north dissolve into windswept deserts, into mountains so high their peaks vanish into cloud, into roads that are not roads at all, but shifting sands and trails beaten by countless feet. Here lies the Silk Road, not one path but many, arteries of earth and stone, linking empire to empire, belief to belief, tongue to tongue. It was the highway of goods and ideas, where silk crossed with gold, where spices mingled with incense, where secrets traveled as swiftly as caravans. And along this road the symbol returned, written not only on stone and wood but on silk, on bronze, on the hearts of monks and mystics. Merchants carried wealth, yes, but they carried stories too. They carried whispers of gods, images of sacred, signs, fragments of songs. In their saddlebags, between rolls of silk and jars of saffron, lay scrolls inked with unfamiliar shapes, charms hammered into silver, painted talismans to be sold in market stalls from Samarkand to Chang'an. Among them, scattered like seeds, the forbidden symbol found new soil. In India, where philosophy flowered alongside trade, the mark emerged in temples and scriptures. Here, it was bound to cosmic order. In Vedic hymns and Brahmanic rituals, geometry was not mere decoration, but a language of truth. The square, the circle, the spiral, all held meaning. And the forbidden symbol, whether scratched into palm leaf manuscripts or drawn in sand during ritual, was tied to balance, to cycles, to the unseen harmony beneath the chaos of the world. Buddhist monks too took it into their hands. They wove it into mandalas, those vast intricate designs meant to map the cosmos itself. In Tibet and the Himalayan kingdoms, mandalas became gateways of meditation, visual prayers for order and transcendence. Within their spirals and symmetry the symbol appeared, not as curse but as key. To meditate upon it was to move inward, to step across the threshold between illusion and truth. Painted in brilliant colors, traced with gold dust, hidden within wheels of Dharma, it became a bridge between worlds. Yet even here, in the sanctity of temples, its double nature lingered. Some monks whispered that it was too powerful, too dangerous to meditate upon directly. Just as the Norse berserkers feared being consumed by frenzy, some mystics feared losing themselves in visions too vast, too bright, too shattering for the human mind to endure. The mark opened doors, but not every traveler returned. Farther, east in China, the symbol appeared in bronze, in jade, in the scripts of sages. Taoist texts spoke of hidden patterns within heaven and earth, of yin and yang, of the 10,000 things born from the One. To them, symbols were not inventions, but revelations, the universe itself writing in lines of water, fire, stone, and breath. The mark became part of this greater script, carved into amulets meant to protect the living, painted on walls to ward off spirits, branded onto armor to turn aside blades. Soldiers carried it into battle, sewn into banners that flapped like dragons in the wind. But the Chinese, ever wary of imbalance, treated the mark with caution. Some saw it as a talisman of order, while others whispered of its shadow, a shape that could summon not protection, but calamity. In manuals of magic, it appeared as both charm and curse, a sign to call storms or to calm them, to summon fortune or to scatter it like dust. And always across India, Tibet, and China, the question arose, did the merchants bring this mark, carried like silk along the trade routes, or was it born again, spontaneously, in each land? Did it ride the caravans from temple to temple, or does the human mind, gazing into the abyss, always draw the same shapes, find the same doors? Consider the mandalas of Tibet, the yantras of India, the talismans of Taoist ritual. Each in its own way uses geometry to trap or release power. Each repeats, in slightly different forms, the forbidden mark. Perhaps it's spread by hand, by brush, by whispered teaching, Or perhaps it flowered naturally in different soils, like the same plant blooming on faraway mountains. Mystics across Asia debated its meaning. In monasteries perched on cliffsides, monks spun prayer wheels that contained the symbol among their turning scripts. In desert caravans, merchants traded it as a charm to ward off thieves and disease. In courts of emperors, it appeared on lacquered screens and painted scrolls, a hidden sign within grander designs. In battlefields, it was carved into shields, carried like the Norse once carried it, into the storm of war. But wherever it appeared, its dual nature never vanished. It was always double-edged, both light and shadow, blessing and curse. In India, yogis spoke of it as a key to meditation, yet warned that the same key could unlock madness. In China, generals trusted it for protection, but feared it might betray them in battle. In Tibet, monks placed it in mandalas, but hid it in layers, veiling it beneath outer designs so that only initiates could glimpse it. To reveal it too openly was to risk its misuse. The Silk Road itself became a stage for its contradictions. In Samarkand, merchants from Persia sold charms carved with it beside incense from India. In Kashgar, a monk from Nalanda debated a Taoist sage about its meaning, one calling it a path to enlightenment, the other a weapon against demons. In Dunhuang, hidden caves held scrolls where the symbol gleamed faintly among painted bodhisattvas. In Chang'an, it adorned silk robes carried into the court of the Tang emperors, its meaning half known, half forgotten, yet never ignored. Always, the caravans carried it onward, east and west. Always it traveled with silk and spice, shadowing the trade of gold and jade. Some tales tell of disasters linked to it, as if to echo the Norse and Romans before. A caravan in the Taklamakan desert, they say, vanished after carrying charms too heavily inscribed. Storms rose, sand swallowed the camels, and only fragments of silk were ever found. In Tibet, a monastery collapsed after a monk dared to draw it too boldly on the walls, as if the mountains themselves rejected it. In China, generals who branded it on armor won great victories, but some too fell swiftly, their triumphs turning to ash within a single season. Why would a shape so simple inspire such fear, again and again? Why would it rise in every culture, tied to gods, spirits, mysteries, curses? The question lingers like incense smoke across the Silk Road. Was it a universal truth, glimpsed in dream and vision, or a contagion of symbols passed from hand to hand like coin? The truth may lie in both. The Silk Road was never one way. Ideas did not simply travel. They merged, they transformed, they took root and blossomed anew. A charm from India could inspire a talisman in Tibet. A mandala from Tibet could echo in Chinese art. The forbidden mark carried across this great web of roads became many things at once, sacred, profane, protective, destructive. And so it endured, not as one meaning but as many, not as a single truth but as a mirror, reflecting the fears and hopes of every land it touched. The Silk Road wound onward, past deserts and mountains, past monasteries and palaces, past camps of nomads and cities of emperors. It carried silks, spices and secrets, and among them always the shadow of the forbidden symbol, until at last its roads led farther still. Across the oceans, beyond the edges of Asian maps, another world waited, one of temples in jungles, pyramids rising from forests, cities of gold and stone. There too the mark would be found, carved into walls where no caravan had ever passed. The road winds into the Americas. The Silk Road fades behind us, dissolving into the salt air of oceans that no merchant caravans had yet crossed. Here, in another hemisphere, on another continent, a parallel story was unfolding. Strange, impossible, and unsettling. In the Idaho shadowed jungles of Mesoamerica, among temples that rose like stone mountains from the green earth, the forbidden symbol appeared once more. It was etched into the walls of pyramids, carved into altars, painted in bright pigments on plaster that still clings to stone after centuries of rain. Priests in jaguar skins carried it in rituals, tracing its shape in ashes and in blood. Warriors painted it onto their shields before stepping into the chaos of battle. and always it appeared in connection with the great god of knowledge, renewal, and destruction, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. Why here? Why again? How could two worlds, separated by an ocean unknown to each other, dream the same forbidden mark into existence? The question unsettles even now. For the Maya and the Aztecs knew nothing of Greece or Rome, or the long caravans that wound along the Silk Road. Their world was bounded by the sea, their history traced through maize fields and volcanic mountains, their gods born of rainstorms and obsidian blades. Yet when the archaeologist's lantern shines against stone in Chichen Itza or Teotihuacan, there it is again, the same symbol, the same mark, carrying the same fear. The temples of Quetzalcoatl were not quiet places. They thundered with drums, with chants, with the cries of sacrifice. The serpent god was worshipped as creator and destroyer, as bringer of life and bringer of chaos. His temples were decorated with feathers of bright green quetzals, shimmering like emerald fire, and with the scales of serpents. But within those same temples, hidden in carvings, or tucked into the patterns of murals, the forbidden mark appeared, again and again. Priests warned against speaking of it aloud. Some glyphs suggest it was considered too dangerous to name, a thing bound to silence, as though the very vibration of its sound in human throat might call down storms, famine, or worse. Even in cultures that recorded their histories on stone stele, on bark paper codices, in richly painted hieroglyphs, there are gaps where one expects words, places where the silence seems deliberate, intentional, fearful. For the Aztecs, who inherited the mythos of earlier peoples, the symbol carried both reverence and terror. To draw it was to call upon the power of Quetzalcoatl, a god who embodied wisdom, culture, and rebirth, yet also destruction and exile. Their myths told of cycles, worlds born, destroyed, and remade again. The mark, carved on temple steps or etched into ritual objects, seemed tied to this cycle. A reminder that the world itself was fragile, that creation and annihilation were separated only by a line as thin as a blade of obsidian. Archaeologists have found fragments of painted pottery where the symbol curls between feathers and serpent coils. They have unearthed charms carried by warriors, inscribed with it alongside glyphs for fire and blood. In murals, it hides in the background, not always visible at first glance, like a shadow woven into the brighter colors of ritual and myth. And then there are the codices, the few that survived conquest and burning. In their pages, filled with gods, kings, calendars, and sacrifices, the symbol emerges like a whisper. It is there beside depictions of the underworld, where souls travel through rivers of blood and mountains of knives. It is there in connection with eclipses, when the sun darkens and order trembles. Always, it is paired with fear, with silence, with the unspoken. Why the silence? Why the dread? The Maya believed that words themselves carried power, that to name something was to summon it. They understood time in cycles, the universe in layers, each connected by fragile threads. Perhaps they saw in the forbidden mark a thread that could unravel the whole design, a key that could unlock but also unmake. To draw it was safe if hidden, wrapped in ritual. To speak it, perhaps, was to cut the thread. The Aztecs, too, feared the collapse of order. Their rituals of sacrifice were not born from cruelty alone, but from terror. The terror that the sun might not rise, that the world might end, if blood did not nourish the gods. Within this cosmic anxiety, the forbidden mark became more than a decoration. It became a sign of danger, of boundaries one should not cross, and yet, despite their fear, they could not leave it behind. They painted it. They carved it. They held it close, as the Greeks once whispered of it, as the Romans outlawed it, as the Norse feared it in battle. Even in silence it spoke. Even in fear they drew it. Consider the parallels. In Greece, philosophers hinted but would not say. In Rome, priests warned against its use even as soldiers carried it into war. Among the Norse it was both gift and curse, a sign that could bring madness as easily as victory. Along the Silk Road, monks and mystics hid it in mandalas, in yantras, in talismans. And here, across the ocean, the Maya and Aztecs feared to name it at all. The weight of coincidence grows heavier with each step. How could civilizations, separated by distance and time, each treat the same simple mark with the same mingled awe and terror? Some suggest trade carried it farther than we know, that ancient sailors crossed oceans before Columbus, bringing with them fragments of symbols, stories, and fears. Others suggest something deeper, that the human mind staring into the void finds the same shapes, the same doors, whether in Athens or Tenochtitlan. Perhaps the forbidden mark is not transmitted, but discovered again and again, as though it waits within the human soul. The temples of Mesoamerica rise now in silence. Vines creep over steps where once drums shook the ground. The cries of sacrifice have faded into the rustle of leaves, yet the carvings remain. In the shadowed corridors of Teotihuacan, beneath the painted ceilings of Bonampak, within the ruins of Chichen Itza, the mark still lingers. Weathered, broken, but not erased, it is still there, waiting. And so too is the silence. The priests are gone. Their chants no longer echo between stone walls, but the absence remains. The deliberate refusal to name, the careful avoidance in their texts. It is a silence that hums louder than sound, a silence that warns us even now. Why the same fear in two worlds separated by an ocean? Perhaps because the mark is not bound by geography. Perhaps it is older than oceans, older than civilizations, older even than memory. The Spaniards, when they came, saw only idols and superstition. They burned the codices, smashed the statues, toppled the temples. Yet even they noted in their chronicles that some signs were considered forbidden, spoken of only in hushed tones, avoided even under torture. One friar wrote of prisoners who, asked to describe their gods, refused to utter certain shapes and names, as though silence itself was safer than speech. The drums fade, the fires dim, the feathered serpent coils back into shadow, the forbidden mark remains. And beyond the Atlantic, in another land, another story stirs. In cathedrals rising from stone, in chants whispered by monks, in manuscripts, illuminated in golden ink, the mark will appear again. The drums of sacrifice fade into medieval chants. The Middle Ages were a time when faith and fear twined together like threads in a single tapestry, when every stone church and every village rumour carried both the promise of salvation and the threat of damnation. Into this strange and shadowed world the symbol returned, no less mysterious than it had been in Greece, Rome, or the frozen north. But here it met something different, not merely a society that whispered about magic or feared omens, but a church that sought to rule over souls, thoughts, and even the imagination itself. Europe's Middle Ages were an age of guardianship, when priests stood watch over knowledge, when bishops declared which ideas could live and which must burn, when the pulpit thundered against heresy while the people listened, half in awe and half in terror. And in that fragile silence, the forbidden mark appeared once again, caught between condemnation and preservation, between the flicker of candle flames and the cold permanence of stone. From the earliest centuries of Christendom, strange shapes and signs were treated with suspicion. Crosses and fish were safe. They carried meanings tied directly to Scripture. But what of the marks that had no place in the holy text? What of the strange geometry carried from pagan temples, from Greek philosophers, from the half-remembered ruins of Rome? To most priests, such things were dangerous remnants, echoes of false gods, whisperings of sorcery. The mark in question, with its looping form and its unsettling symmetry, became an object of dread. Preachers warned that witches used it in their nocturnal rites, scrawling it on doorframes, etching it into charms, invoking it as a key to darker powers. In sermons, it was often grouped with omens of the devil, black cats, cursed wells, strange herbs gathered under a new moon. By the 10th and 11th centuries, church councils were already instructing inquisitors and confessors to watch for such symbols, to treat them as evidence of dealings with the infernal. And yet, paradoxically, the very same centuries that condemned the mark also preserved it in unexpected ways. It is there, carved into the stone ribs of cathedrals, hidden within the geometry of Gothic arches, repeated in the coloured glass of rose windows. It is there beneath the feet of worshippers in tiled floors and overhead in vaulted ceilings. Those who came to pray would never have noticed it, for it was seldom presented openly. Instead, it was woven into patterns, disguised as ornament, wrapped in the beauty of architecture and art. In these sacred spaces, the mark was not denounced but enshrined, set in glass and stone that would outlast generations. Why? That is the question that echoes through the medieval silence. Why would masons and glassmakers risk including a shape that priests thundered against? Why would bishops and patrons, if they recognized it at all, allow it? Some historians say it was simple superstition, that builders, often working in dangerous conditions, carved the mark into their structures as a charm of protection. A cathedral roof was a perilous thing, its stones weighing tons, its beams stretching high into the sky. To the masons, the mark may have been an old safeguard, a secret invocation to keep the structure standing, to shield workers from death. Others believe the builders were themselves keepers of older traditions, members of guilds that carried hidden knowledge, geometry, mathematics, philosophy, that stretched back not merely to Rome, but perhaps to Egypt and Mesopotamia. For them, the mark was not diabolical but divine, an echo of cosmic order, a signature of eternity itself, and still others whisper that the paradox was intentional, that the Church itself, even while condemning the mark in words, allowed it. In practice, because it could not truly rid itself of it. Medieval theology was filled with contradictions. Priests railed against sin, even as they depicted it vividly in frescoes. Bishops warned against lust, even as they filled the margins of manuscripts with grotesques and devils. In such a climate, perhaps the mark was too deeply embedded in the patterns of art and memory to be erased. To forbid it entirely would have been to cut away part of the architecture of thought itself. So instead, it was condemned in sermons, but carved in silence, outlawed in doctrine but immortalized in stone. Consider the great cathedrals of France, Chartres, Amiens, Reims. To step inside is to enter a world of light and shadow, where stained glass turns sunlight into fire and stone rises like frozen music. In the rose windows of Chartres, amidst the spirals of saints and prophets, one can trace the forbidden mark repeated in subtle patterns. The faithful, gazing upward, saw only beauty, but the design was there nonetheless, woven into the geometry of heaven. In England, at Canterbury, the same shape can be found carved into capitals of columns half hidden among vines and beasts. In Germany, at Cologne, the tiled floor of a side chapel bears it faintly, worn down by centuries of footsteps. These were not accidents. Stonecutters and glassmakers were deliberate in their craft. The mark did not appear by chance. The paradox extended beyond architecture into the world of manuscripts. Monks who spent their lives copying texts in scriptoriums sometimes slipped the symbol into their illuminations. A curling vine in the margin might end in its form. The halo of a saint might conceal its lines. A labyrinth drawn as a meditation. On the soul might carry its pattern at the center. In some cases it seems almost playful, a private joke of the scribe. In others it feels reverent, a way of preserving knowledge that could not be spoken aloud. The monks may have been forbidden to write certain words, but they could still draw certain shapes, and in those shapes memory was kept alive. But what of the ordinary people, those who had never seen a manuscript or read a bishop's decree? For them the mark often meant danger. Folk tales from across Europe speak of strange scratches on doors, of farmers who claimed the mark appeared in the dirt near their fields, of women accused of drawing it to blight the crops of neighbors. In these tales, the symbol was evidence enough for suspicion. Witches, they said, left it behind like a footprint. When the Inquisition rose in the 13th century, inquisitors were trained to look for it in charms, in spell books, on the skin of accused heretics. There are records of trials in which possession of an object marked with it was enough to condemn a person to the flames. The cruelty of these contradictions cannot be overstated. In one German town, a woman was accused because the symbol was found carved into the beams of her cottage. She was executed as a servant of the devil, and yet in the same town, the cathedral that towered above her bore the mark in its rose window, where light streamed through it each morning onto the altar. The poor were punished for what the powerful preserved. The symbol, like so much else, in the Middle Ages was not judged equally. It was a tool for oppression as well as a vessel of memory. Still, its endurance is undeniable. Even as flames consumed manuscripts, even as inquisitors hunted witches, the mark continued to appear. Builders carved it, artists painted it, worshippers walked beneath it. The Middle Ages, with all their shadows, did not erase it. In fact, they gave it a new power, for to survive condemnation is to prove resilience. The symbol became both more feared and more enduring, a paradox written into the very bones of Europe. As centuries passed, the tension deepened. The late Satizé medieval period saw both greater paranoia and greater creativity. The Black Death in the 14th century darkened the imagination of Europe, filling it with visions of death and apocalypse. In that age of fear, the symbol was even more closely linked to witchcraft. Yet at the same time, Gothic architecture reached its height, embedding the mark more intricately than ever in glass and stone. Cathedrals rose higher, windows widened, light flooded in, and in that light the symbol was there, gleaming in hidden patterns. It is tempting to see this contradiction as hypocrisy, but perhaps it was something deeper. The Middle Ages were an age when mystery itself was considered holy. To know fully was not always the goal. To wonder, to stand in awe, was often closer to faith. The mark, forbidden yet preserved, embodied that paradox. It was dangerous, and yet it was needed. It was heretical, and yet it was sacred. It reminded those who saw it that truth could not always be spoken aloud, that some knowledge survived in silence, in stone, in glass, waiting for another age to interpret it. As the 15th century drew to a close, candles burned in cathedrals across Europe, their flames flickering against stained glass, their light glimmering over carvings and arches that had preserved the forbidden mark for hundreds of years. But new fires were beginning to glow, fires of curiosity, of rediscovery, of a rebirth of learning. The Renaissance was dawning, and with it came a new hunger for ancient wisdom. Soon scholars would dust off forgotten manuscripts, architects would rediscover classical proportion, and artists would paint with freedom and daring. In that coming fire, the old symbol would not fade. It would ignite again, charged with new, meaning carried forward into a world no longer satisfied with silence. The candles of the Middle Ages dimmed, and in their dying glow the mark remained, carved into stone, hidden in light, waiting for the fires of the Renaissance to awaken it. Once more. The Renaissance was an age of rebirth, of rediscovery, of restless curiosity that could not be contained by the cloisters of monasteries or the narrow sermons of pulpits. As the Middle Ages dimmed, as the candles of faith flickered against the high walls of cathedrals, a new light spread across Europe, the light of inquiry, of human ambition, of the conviction that forgotten truths might yet be reclaimed. Into this shifting world, the old symbol surfaced once more. Where priests of the medieval centuries had denounced it as a mark of witchcraft, the new thinkers of the Renaissance looked at it differently. They did not see a curse, but a code, not a heresy, but a key. To them, the symbol hinted at secret harmonies, at connections between heaven and earth, at knowledge once known to ancients but now buried beneath layers of dogma and fear. In the quiet pages of notebooks, in the locked drawers of scholars, in the candle-lit chambers of alchemists, it appeared again, this time not as a warning but as a promise. Alchemists were among the first to seize upon it. Their world was one of secrecy, a twilight between science and magic, where furnaces burned not only with metal, but with metaphor. To them, lead was not simply a dull metal, but the image of base. Existence, and gold was not merely treasure, but the perfection of spirit. Between the two lay a journey, a transformation both chemical and divine, and the symbol seemed to whisper of that hidden passage. Old treatises on alchemy, copied and recopied, began to include the mark in their diagrams. Circles, triangles, suns, and moons were joined by the looping, intricate design that was said to unlock the mystery of the philosopher's stone. In some drawings, it hovered above retorts and crucibles. In others, it framed the stages of transformation. Negredo, albedo, rubedo, the blackening, the whitening, the reddening of matter and soul. But the alchemists were not alone. Across Europe, secret societies formed, men and women who believed that truth could not be entrusted to kings or bishops, who held that wisdom must be protected, veiled, passed only from hand to hand, mouth to ear, sign to sign. Lodges met in basements, in candlelit halls, in abandoned cloisters. There, amidst symbols etched in chalk on the floor, the forbidden mark was traced again and again, a cipher of recognition. To speak its meaning aloud was dangerous, but to draw it was to declare allegiance to a fellowship of seekers. Whispers travelled through cities, Florence, Prague, London, that the lodges knew secrets from the ancients, that they guarded fragments of wisdom from Egypt, Greece, even Babylon. In their rituals, the mark appeared not as a stigma, but as a doorway, a passage to hidden chambers of thought. The age's greatest minds were not immune to its allure. Leonardo da Vinci, that restless genius whose notebooks still astonish with their blend of art and anatomy, mechanics and philosophy, scattered the mark through his pages. Sometimes it was hidden in the interlacing of gears, sometimes buried in the sketches of flowing water, sometimes woven into the curls of hair in a portrait. For Leonardo, the world was a labyrinth of design, a grand machine built by invisible laws, and the symbol seemed to him a hint of those laws, a clue left behind in nature's script. In his coded writings, where words were reversed and meaning disguised, the mark appears like a watermark of secrecy, a whisper to those who could decipher it. Was it protection? A charm to ward away the eyes of the Inquisition? Or was it a key, a private reminder that all his inventions, all his studies, were part of a greater puzzle? No one can say for certain, but its presence in his notebooks ties him to a current of thought that flowed beneath the polished surface of the Renaissance. Others followed paths just as enigmatic. Marsilio Ficino, philosopher and translator of Plato, wove symbols into his commentaries that some believe echo the forbidden mark. Paracelsus, the wandering physician and alchemist, filled his works with cryptic emblems, some of which curve into shapes nearly identical to it. Giordano Bruno, that fiery Dominican friar who dared to speak of infinite worlds, infinite suns, infinite possibilities, drew it in the margins of his speculative treatises. For these thinkers, the Renaissance was not only a revival of art and literature, but of mystery, of hidden wisdom that might explain the cosmos itself. The symbol was not a superstition to be feared, but a map to be followed. This was the age of coded manuscripts, of books that concealed more than they revealed. Printers, newly empowered by movable type, reproduced works that disguised ancient secrets in allegories and diagrams. Readers who looked casually saw only decoration, but the initiate saw the mark, woven into borders, repeating in the geometry of title pages, glowing in the arrangement of letters. Entire volumes circulated that were little more than labyrinths of symbols, their true meaning accessible only to those trained to see. The mark functioned as a beacon in these texts, guiding the reader to hidden layers of knowledge. Some said that within such books lay instructions for transmutation. Others whispered they contained the lost wisdom of Atlantis, and still others believed they were coded maps to spiritual enlightenment. As the Renaissance matured, the mark became a language in itself, exchanged in letters between scholars. A drawing in the corner of a page was enough to identify an ally, a safe correspondent, a fellow traveler in the search for truth. Across borders, from Italy to France, from Germany to England, men of learning corresponded in riddles and emblems. At times they invoked biblical language, at times the allegories of alchemy. But beneath it all, the symbol persisted, a sign of recognition, a conspiratorial nod across distance and danger. The secrecy was necessary. The Church, though shaken by schisms and threatened by reform, still wielded power enough to crush dissent. To be accused of heresy was no small matter, and to be linked to forbidden knowledge was perilous. Yet the symbol moved in shadows protected by its ambiguity. It could be dismissed as ornament by those who did not know. It could be defended as mere geometry if questioned. Only those initiated into its meaning understood that it was not decoration, but doctrine, not superstition, but science hidden in allegory. In this way it survived, nourished in secret while the Renaissance unfolded in the open. The symbol's conspiratorial role reached even into art. Painters who filled their canvases with saints and Madonnas sometimes smuggled it into halos, into folds of cloth, into architectural backdrops. To the casual eye, nothing was unusual. But the trained observer saw it. Sculptors placed it in reliefs. Goldsmiths etched it into chalices, and map-makers worked it into the compass roses of their charts. Even music, some suggest, carried its pattern in the hidden mathematics of composition. The Renaissance was a time of flourishing beauty, but behind the beauty there was always secrecy, and in that secrecy the mark endured. By the late 16th century, entire fraternities had risen around it. Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and other esoteric brotherhoods traced their roots to the lodges of the Renaissance, carrying forward the legacy of symbols and secrecy. For them, the mark was not merely inherited, it was central, a sign of unity across generations, a reminder that knowledge was not owned by kings or priests, but by those willing to seek it. Their rituals expanded upon the small gatherings of earlier alchemists developing elaborate ceremonies, passwords, oaths, and degrees of initiation. Within these, the symbol was placed at the center, drawn on altars, traced in the air, whispered in chants. The Renaissance had not only rediscovered the mark, it had enshrined it as the very heart of its secret traditions. And yet, even as it flourished in secrecy, the symbol continued to appear in the public world, hiding in plain sight. Architectural projects of the late Renaissance, palaces, gardens, theaters, often bore its pattern in their designs. The gardens of Florence and Rome contained labyrinths whose paths curved in its image. The villas of powerful patrons displayed it in mosaics, sometimes openly, sometimes disguised as playful ornament. These patrons may not have fully understood its meaning, but they enjoyed the prestige of employing architects and artists who did. Knowledge was a currency, and to have a building infused with hidden wisdom was to announce one's participation in the age's great intellectual game. All of this gave the symbol a new identity. Where in the Middle Ages it had been feared as a mark of witchcraft, in the Renaissance it became a mark of privilege, of initiation, of belonging to a hidden fellowship of enlightened souls. It no longer separated the damned from the saved. It separated the ignorant from the initiated. To carry it, to recognize it, was to be part of an invisible community stretching across Europe, bound not by geography, but by secrecy. Still, there was danger. The story of Giordano Bruno reminds us how fragile the balance was. Burned at the stake in 1600, his body consumed by the flames of the Inquisition, he carried with him ideas too bold for his age. In his writings, where the symbol appeared in disguised form, one sees the risk of daring to proclaim aloud what others only whispered. The Renaissance celebrated discovery, but its guardians of orthodoxy still demanded silence. The symbol thrived best in that silence, traveling not in proclamations but in whispers, in diagrams in the margin of a page or the carved line of a stone. Thus the Renaissance became not only a rebirth of knowledge, but also a rebirth of secrecy. The symbol was both shield and key, protecting wisdom from those who would destroy it, and opening doors to those brave enough to pursue it. Through alchemists, philosophers, artists, and lodges, it gained layers of meaning, alchemical, mathematical, mystical, until it was no longer a single mark, but a constellation of ideas, a nexus where art, science, and spirit converged. As the 17th century approached, the lodges grew in number and influence. Their networks expanded beyond craftsmen and alchemists into the nobility, into the rising class of scientists, into the courts of kings. The symbol now marked not only hidden manuscripts, but also secret alliances. Those who bore it could find refuge, patronage, fellowship. It became a password of an underground Europe, a shadow republic of thought. And from those shadows, it began to seep into the light. The lodges inspired salons, gatherings where philosophers and scientists, writers, and artists met to debate, to question, to imagine. In those salons, the symbol lingered, sometimes displayed openly, sometimes hidden in the decorations of the room, sometimes present only in the memory of those who carried it from lodge to parlor. The Renaissance had rediscovered the mark, had preserved it in secrecy, and now on the threshold of the Enlightenment, it was ready to step more boldly into the open world. The fires of the alchemists still glowed, the lodges still whispered, but beyond them new candles were being lit in drawing rooms and parlors. Ideas, no longer confined to manuscripts or stone, began to move more freely in conversation, in debate, in printed books. The secret societies had done their work. The symbol had been carried safely through centuries of peril. Now, as the lodges expanded into salons, the stage was set for a new age. The Enlightenment waited, and with it, the possibility that what had once been hidden could at last be spoken aloud. The Enlightenment announced itself like a dawn rising after a long night. Across Europe, candles burned late in study rooms and salons where men and women debated, challenged, and dismantled old systems of belief. Science was the new scripture, reason the new faith, progress the new destiny. No longer, they said, would humanity be shackled by superstition and shadows. Yet even as telescopes turned toward the heavens and microscopes peered into the invisible, there remained something stubborn, something unyielding, something older than reason itself. It was the symbol, etched in bone, carved into wood, drawn into manuscripts, and it refused to vanish. In fact, it seemed to thrive in the very age that claimed to disprove it. For Enlightenment thinkers, symbols were curiosities of a primitive past. They were explained away as cultural coincidences, geometry mistaken for magic, artifacts of ignorance. The philosophers of Paris, the encyclopedists, the empiricists in London, all declared that truth lay not in hidden meanings, but in measurable laws, gravity, light, motion, and magnetism. They sought to uncover nature's machinery. But as explorers returned from voyages to Africa, Polynesia, and the far Pacific, they carried more than spices, ivory, and stories of distant lands. They carried wood carvings etched with the very same mark, bone totems inscribed with the familiar shape, tattoos burned into the flesh of islanders who had never heard of Greece, Rome, or Mesopotamia. And so the paradox was born. If reason denied the power of the mark, how did it appear everywhere reason dared to look? Imagine the halls of a Parisian salon in the 1760s. Philosophers, musicians, and noble patrons gather under chandeliers. A geographer displays a wooden idol from Tahiti. Its chest bears the unmistakable symbol, bold and deliberate. The room stirs. Some dismiss it with a wave. Mere ornament, a local custom. But others glance at one another insolence, as if sharing a secret. Recognition. The very symbol banned by priests, whispered about by alchemists, carved into cathedrals without permission, now arrived across oceans, unbroken by time, untouched by Western memory. The rational mind could not account for this persistence, and yet the evidence was there in their hands, in their cabinets of curiosities. The Enlightenment promised universality, but here was a true universal that reason could not explain. If the laws of physics were the same across the earth, was it possible that symbols, too, obeyed some hidden law? Could the human mind, in its distant tribes and separate beginnings, arrive at the same geometry not by chance but by necessity? The symbol seemed less like a superstition and more like a fingerprint of thought itself, a shared dream, a rhythm etched into human consciousness. Still, most thinkers tried to bury the question under ridicule. Diderot, the encyclopedist, dismissed talk of magical marks as childish. Voltaire, sharp as ever, mocked the idea that an arrangement of lines could possess power. And yet, even in their writings, one finds strange hesitations. Notes in margins, unpublished drafts, quiet confessions that symbols lingered in memory like echoes in a cave. They rejected the supernatural, yet they could not entirely cleanse their own minds of its shadow. The explorers, however, brought back more than objects. They brought back stories. Polynesian priests warned that the mark should not be drawn outside ritual. African shamans said it called both spirits of healing and spirits of destruction. In the Americas, among tribes beyond European conquest, the same geometry appeared in ritual dances, woven into blankets, or painted on sacred rocks. Each culture knew it differently, feared it differently, but all agreed. It was not just a decoration, it had weight, it had consequence. The paradox deepened when science itself began to stumble upon the mark. Astronomers mapped constellations and noticed the same shape traced in stars. Botanists opened flowers and found the pattern repeated in petals and seeds. Mathematicians working on geometry and the properties of numbers, sketched diagrams that mirrored the ancient sign. Was it coincidence, or was it, as some quietly suspected, that the universe itself was written in symbols, and humanity had merely remembered fragments of that script? A philosopher in Königsberg, walking at dusk, wondered whether the mind itself imposed certain shapes on reality. What if the mark persisted not because of spirits or demons, but because human perception was wired to generate it? What if it was less a symbol chosen by cultures, and more a shadow cast by the way brains structured experience? This idea, too, was radical, for it meant that the mark was not simply out there in the world, it was within us, inseparable from the act of being human. And yet, with every explanation, unease remained. If the symbol was harmless geometry, why did priests in Polynesia warn explorers never to draw it casually? If it was just the product of perception, why did those who wore it in battle speak of strange trances, uncanny strength, or madness? If it was coincidence, why did it return again and again without communication, without contact, as if cultures across millennia heard the same whispered instruction in their sleep? In the salons and societies of Europe, whispers turned into speculation. Secret lodges, already steeped in Renaissance occultism, saw in the symbol not a superstition but a proof. To them, its persistence across continents was evidence that there was a hidden order binding the world together, one older and deeper than Scripture. They drew it quietly on their meeting tables, carved it into rings, inscribed it into coded diagrams. They declared that while reason lit the surface, symbols revealed the undercurrent. It was not one or the other, but both. The Enlightenment, for all its pride in clarity, lived with shadows at its edge. In London coffeehouses, Newton's laws were praised, yet Newton himself had spent decades secretly studying alchemy, chasing the same mysteries reason denied. In Germany, natural philosophers tried to reconcile experiment with myth, arguing that perhaps the ancients encoded truths in symbols long before instruments could measure them. Even in the universities, where scholars swore to strip away nonsense, the symbol found a home tucked in margins of mathematical treatises or sketched beside notes and music theory. The paradox of the Enlightenment was this: reason could not destroy the symbol, because the symbol had never belonged to superstition alone. It lived in the stars, in the flowers, in the bones of explorers' artifacts, and in the quiet corners of the human mind. Rationalism dismissed it as meaningless, yet the more the world was measured, the more the shape appeared, as if mocking the arrogance of certainty. And so, the 18th century ended with both triumph and unease. Nations declared the rights of man, revolutions overturned thrones, science charted the heavens. But in the midst of progress, the mark endured, slipping past every boundary, laughing softly from the walls of temples, the tattoos of sailors, the eyes of idols. Was it a superstition, a secret law of geometry, a shadow of the human mind? Or was it, as some dared to whisper, the trace of something that watched from beyond reason, waiting for recognition? The Enlightenment never answered the question. It only sharpened it. The symbol could not be erased, nor explained, nor owned. It remained what it had always been, a reminder that even in an age of light, darkness persisted at the edges. And so, the story flows onward, the telescopes lifting their gaze higher, searching the skies, and finding, to their astonishment, the same mark shining in the constellations. The Enlightenment had set its telescopes skyward, hoping to find order in the heavens, and order was indeed revealed, though not the kind that banished mystery. Instead, the vast dome of night seemed to whisper the same old refrain, a familiar geometry written in stars, arcs, and planetary paths. Astronomers charting the constellations drew careful diagrams and returned time and again to the same troubling realization. The mark was there. Not just once, not just in one cluster or one pattern, but scattered throughout the sky, hidden in the constellations that shepherds had named since antiquity, and even in the very paths of planets as they curved across the ecliptic. The heavens, it seemed, were not free from the symbol. They were embroidered with it. At first, the discovery was dismissed as imagination. Human beings had always been prone to see familiar figures in the stars: hunters, lions, serpents, chariots of fire. Perhaps this too was nothing more than the mind's insistence on order, a reflection of earthly fears and longings projected onto the vast indifference of space. Yet the more precise the measurements became, the more uncanny the alignments appeared. Geometries once hidden in myth took on the sharp lines of mathematics. The shape was not just suggested by chance, it was formed by stellar arrangements that seemed almost intentional. Astronomers whispered of triangles nested within circles, of arcs that bent into the unmistakable motif. If the symbol was imagination, then the universe itself seemed to conspire with that imagination, sketching it over and over upon the canvas of the night. Mystics, of course, rejoiced. For them, it was confirmation of what they had always claimed, that the mark was not a human invention but a cosmic truth, a key to the architecture of reality. They spoke of the heavens as a mirror and the symbol as its reflection, appearing in earthly carvings, temples, and manuscripts only because it had first been written in their stars. As above, so below, the alchemist had said, and here was proof. If the constellations bore the mark, then all the fears and reverence of countless cultures were not misguided after all. They were glimpses of a universal design. The tension between science and mysticism deepened. Rationalists argued that the symbol was coincidence, a trick of perception, no more significant than the shape of clouds drifting across the sky. Yet ace instruments improved. Coincidence grew, harder to sustain as an explanation. The paths of Mars, Venus, and Saturn seemed to trace the geometry across the zodiac with almost ritual precision, as though the planets themselves performed a slow, eternal dance in obedience to a hidden diagram. Astronomers, unwilling to concede to mystics, spoke in careful language. Apparent symmetry, recurring formations, mathematical artifact. But the truth was harder to contain. Observers in Europe, in India, in China, in Arabia, all noted the same patterns, all reported the same alignments. The universe, impartial and vast, seemed to return the human gaze with a knowing glance. For sailors at sea, the discovery was uncanny. Navigators relied on the stars for guidance, plotting courses across oceans by their familiar maps. But when the geometry of the symbol began to appear in those same maps, when lines between guiding stars seemed to echo the forbidden mark, an unease grew among crews. Superstition, long mocked by officers and cartographers, returned in hushed tones. Some sailors refused to sail beneath certain skies, claiming the mark was an omen of storms or mutiny. Others tattooed the symbol on their bodies as protection, believing that if the heavens bore it, then wearing it would align them with fate's design. In the academies of Europe, debate raged. Was the universe structured by chance or by law? If law, could that law be expressed in symbols as well as numbers? Kepler, long before, had searched for harmony in planetary motion, describing their orbits as celestial music. Now, centuries later, astronomers found that the old harmonies were joined by an old shape, the same one carved into bone and temple stone across civilizations. Some whispered that perhaps geometry itself carried memory, that the same forms repeated because they belonged to the deep grammar of existence, not to culture alone. Mystics expanded their cosmologies. They spoke of the symbol as a gateway, a portal that connected the microcosm of human life to the macrocosm of galaxies. Just as the symbol could be found in the spiral of a shell, in the branching of trees, in the pulse of blood through the body, so too could it be traced in the heavens. To them, this was no coincidence but revelation, that the same signature marked the small and the infinite alike. The human body was a constellation. The constellation was a body. The boundary between earth and sky dissolved under the symbol's recurring shape. Poets, too, found themselves entranced. The Romantic Age, suspicious of cold rationalism, embraced the image of a universe woven with hidden signs. They wrote of lovers gazing into constellations that mirrored the Marxian ancient ruins, of night skies whispering secrets that no telescope could measure. To the poets, the symbol was not threat but invitation, an opening into awe, a proof that wonder persisted even in an age of industry and steel. The cosmos, they declared, was not empty after all. It was speaking, always speaking, if only one knew how to listen. Yet the paradox remained. If the mark was universal, what did it signify? Was it the trace of a creator, a divine architect leaving signature in both stone and star? Was it the residue of human cognition, a pattern the brain imposed upon chaos? Or was it something stranger still, a communication not yet deciphered, a signal written into the fabric of space-time, waiting for recognition? Each possibility carried its own terror. If divine, then humanity had ignored a holy script for millennia. If cognitive, then the mind itself was trapped in an endless loop, forever redrawing the same geometry no matter the medium. If communication, then someone, or something, had left a message vast enough to span the galaxies. Astronomers who once prided themselves on reason confessed in journals to sleepless nights. The more they mapped the heavens, the more the symbols stared back. In observatories perched on mountains, lenses of polished glass captured light that had traveled for centuries, only to reveal once again the same geometry. Each new discovery deepened the question rather than solved it. The universe was no longer merely vast, it was intimate, recursive, haunted by the same shape that had followed humanity across continents and centuries. And yet, the heavens did not explain themselves. Stars burned, planets moved, galaxies turned, but none spoke their purpose. The mark lingered in silence, neither confirming nor denying the interpretations it inspired. Like all mysteries, it thrived in ambiguity. Some declared it proof of unity, others saw it as mockery, still others as destiny. It became less a symbol of knowledge than of the limits of knowledge, a reminder that even as telescopes pierced the night, the questions only grew deeper. By the close of the 18th century and the dawn of the 19th, the cosmic reflection of the mark had settled into human consciousness. It appeared on star maps, in secret societies' rituals, in poets' verses, in sailors' tattoos. It had become both scientific anomaly and spiritual revelation, a bridge no one could fully cross. And as the skies filled with smoke from factories, as the age of industry dawned, the old constellations were still there, shimmering above soot and iron, carrying the same shape into the future. The cosmos, infinite and indifferent, had reflected back humanity's most persistent mystery, and as chimneys rose and furnaces roared, the stars remained, whispering quietly the geometry that no revolution of reason or industry could erase. The night sky, patient and eternal, carried the symbol still, waiting for humanity to decide what it meant. The 19th century opened with smoke. The clang of iron, the hiss of steam, the turning of wheels, and the hammering of steel became the new heartbeat of the world. Cities swelled with workers drawn from countryside to factory floor, their days measured not by the rising of the sun, but by the unrelenting tick of the machine. Chimneys towered like man-made mountains, coughing soot into the skies that had once held constellations. To Harmony it seemed as if humanity had finally torn free from the enchantments of the past. The ancient world of charms and omens, of whispered symbols and sacred signs, was being replaced by progress, industry, and rational power. Yet even as iron, tracks stretched across continents and telegraph wires stitched together distant lands, another current ran beneath the age of smoke, the occult revival. And at the center of that revival, emerging with uncanny persistence, was the same old symbol. It is a paradox worth lingering on. At the very moment humanity prided itself on reason and machinery, the appetite for mystery grew sharper. Factories standardized the day, but dreams thickened at night. In London, Paris, Berlin, and New York, societies formed in secret, drawing in men of science and literature, statesmen and artisans who gathered in lamplit chambers to speak of things modernity could not explain. They wore aprons and sashes, lit candles in precise patterns, and traced ancient signs on floors of polished wood. These were the Freemasons, heirs to medieval guilds, yet devoted to mysteries far older. Their temples were built of stone and metaphor alike, their rituals borrowed from builders' lore, biblical visions, and alchemical allegories. And among their symbols, square, compass, eye, star, one shape reappeared with almost defiant constancy. The Freemasons were not alone. The 19th century gave birth to the Theosophical Society, whose founders declared that beneath all religions lay a hidden truth, one encoded in symbols. They scoured Sanskrit scriptures, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Hebrew mysticism for fragments of the lost wisdom, and wherever they looked, they found the mark. To them, it was not heresy but harmony, a proof that cultures separated by oceans and centuries had each received a shard of the same revelation. Their journals printed diagrams of the symbol alongside translations of Vedic hymns and Kabbalistic diagrams, treating it as a universal key. Why did this occur then, in an age that prided itself on moving beyond superstition? Perhaps because industry stripped daily life of mystery. Machines explained what had once been magic. Factories imposed rhythms older societies had left to the stars. Progress was swift, but it was cold. Against the soot and steel, against the shrieking engines and suffocating alleys, the imagination yearned for something older, softer, more hidden. The occult revival was not so much a rebellion against reason, as a supplement to it, a way of keeping alive the sense that life was more than calculation and profit. And so, as railways grew, so too did secret lodges. As the telegraph wired continents, whispers spread of ancient wisdom being reborn. The paradox deepened further when men of science themselves joined. It was not uncommon for physicists, chemists, and physicians to attend seances, to sit with mediums to scribble down formulas by day, and attend rituals by night. Electricity, magnetism, and unseen forces fascinated them, and the boundary between experiment and enchantment blurred. The same men who refined engines and catalogued minerals also discussed the possibility of spiritual vibrations and hidden energies. The old symbol, when traced on paper or carved inward, became a way to imagine those forces, a diagram not of superstition, but of the invisible architecture of reality. Literature, too, carried the revival. Writers such as Bulwer Lytton, William Butler Yeats, and Arthur Machen wove secret signs into their stories, presenting the industrial age not as an end to wonder, but as a veil behind which deeper mysteries stirred. The Victorian reader, weary of soot-stained streets, found in these tales the thrill of hidden societies and secret wisdom. Even the popular press-printed columns on seances, hypnotism, and Oriental mysticism, and in illustrations the recurring mark appeared again, sometimes coyly in the border of a magazine, sometimes openly as a declaration of fascination with forgotten lore. The symbol was also etched into architecture. Masonic lodges incorporated it into floor mosaics and ceiling designs. Public buildings, funded by benefactors with Masonic ties, quietly displayed it in cornices, stained glass, or even carved stone, visible to any passerby who knew what to look for. The industrial city, while outwardly modern, carried within it a secret cartography of signs, each pointing back to something older than industry itself. Workers trudging home from the factory might pass under arches adorned with the geometry, never knowing they walked through the same shape once carved on temples, bones, and stars. The Theosophists extended this architectural imagination into the realm of cosmology. They taught that the universe itself was built upon hidden diagrams and that the curring mark was one of its foundational glyphs. In their books, dense with diagrams and allegories, the symbol represented cycles of creation and destruction, the ebb and flow of cosmic ages. To them, the same geometry traced in a medieval cathedral and in the sky above also pulsed within the human soul. By understanding it, one might rise beyond the material, beyond even the machinery of modern life, to glimpse eternity. Of course, not everyone embraced the revival. Clergy often denounced it as heretical or deceptive, accusing secret societies of leading souls astray with false mysteries. Governments eyed them with suspicion, fearing conspiracies beneath their oaths of secrecy. Yet suppression often only deepened fascination. The more a society was whispered about, the more people longed to peer behind the veil. In the age of newspapers, even scandal could serve as advertisement. And so the lodges grew, attracting not only dreamers but also powerful men who believed that in ritual and symbol lay a different kind of authority, one not bound to the visible order of parliaments and factories. The recurring mark became more than decoration. It was invoked as power. During initiations, candidates were shown it as if unveiling a mystery passed down through centuries. In printed tracts, it was explained as a diagram of balance, of harmony, of eternal truth. The fact that scientists dismissed it, priests condemned it, and newspapers mocked it only seemed to heighten its allure. For in that very rejection lay proof to believers that the symbol contained something too dangerous for ordinary society. This was the paradox of the industrial age. While machines extended human power into iron and steam, human longing reached back to symbols carved in stone. Progress and mysticism did not cancel each other. They grew together, like parallel tracks of a railway, carrying humanity forward and backward at once. The more the world mechanized, the more it secretly spiritualized. Beneath the soot of industry, the geometry glowed like an ember refusing to be extinguished. The late 19th century only deepened the revival. Spiritualism spread from America to Europe, with mediums claiming to channel voices of the dead, parlors filled with curious audiences who sat in darkness while tables tipped and faint lights danced. In many of these circles, the symbol appeared, in chalk diagrams drawn on the floor or traced in the air by entranced hands. Was it protection? A gateway? A map for spirits? Explanations varied, but the shape itself returned, as if drawn by some force beyond the conscious minds of participants. Meanwhile, artists of the symbolist movement embraced it, embedding it in paintings that mingled dream with nightmare. They saw in it not doctrine but atmosphere, a reminder that beneath the surface of modern life lurked old unspoken truths. In galleries filled with images of industry, of steel bridges and locomotives, these strange canvases whispered another vision, that the unseen mattered as much as the seen. Critics mocked, but audiences lingered, unable to dismiss the quiet gravity of the recurring mark. By the dawn of the 20th century, the symbol was everywhere. In lodges, in books, in art, in architecture. It had become both commonplace and enigmatic, a sign that could pass unnoticed or strike suddenly with uncanny familiarity. The industrial age, which had promised liberation from superstition, found itself instead haunted by it. The geometry had adapted to the new world, as if soot and steam were no barrier to its endurance. Humanity might build factories to rival mountains, but in the glow of lamplight after work, it still gathered around the same old mystery. And so, as trains thundered and furnaces roared, secret hands continued to trace the forbidden mark. The age of industry did not erase the symbol, it multiplied it, embedding it into the very fabric of modern life. And in that paradox lay a troubling thought. Perhaps progress and superstition were not opposites at all, but partners. Perhaps every machine hummed alongside a whisper, every factory shadowed by a forgotten temple, every symbol preserved in the very moment humanity declared it obsolete. As the century turned, the world would soon face fires more terrible than furnaces, explosions greater than any factory could contain. Thegeometry, once whispered in lodges and printed in esoteric books, would follow humanity into war. And as the soot of industry gave way to the smoke of battle, the symbol would again be seen, etched not just in temples and stars, but in banners, medals, and ruins. The old mark, it seemed, was prepared to march with humanity into its darkest age. The 20th century began with a promise of progress. Electricity lit the streets, automobiles rattled down newly paved roads, and the first airplanes lifted from the earth. People believed the new century would bring peace through invention, prosperity through machines, and harmony through shared knowledge. But beneath that optimism, something darker was stirring. The same industrial forces that built bridges and telegraphs could forge cannons and bombs. The same fascination with symbols that bound secret societies together could be twisted into banners of conquest. And at the heart of this transformation lay the oldest mark of all, the recurring symbol, once whispered in temples and traced in starlight, now sharpened into an emblem of terror. No longer confined to the pages of esoteric books or the mosaics of lodges, the symbol emerged into the open as armies gathered. It was painted on flags, stitched into uniforms, stamped onto coins, and carved into monuments. But the meaning had shifted. What had once been a sign of balance, of eternal cycles, of unity across cultures, became a weaponized glyph. It was no longer a mystery shared in secret. It became a rallying cry, a brand of power. And once it was stolen, its older meaning seemed to vanish beneath the weight of propaganda. The theft was not accidental. Political leaders of the early 20th century recognized the strange power of imagery. Masses could be moved not only by speeches or policies, but by signs that stirred something deeper, something unconscious. A mark that had traveled through centuries, from temples to stars to secret societies, carried a resonance beyond rational explanation. To seize such a symbol was to seize the imagination of millions. When banners unfurled across Europe bearing that crooked cross, it was not simply a political emblem. It was an invocation, a deliberate harnessing of humanity's memory. And it worked. The symbol that had once decorated ancient shrines now adorned steel helmets and propaganda posters. It was painted on tanks, embroidered on armbands, carved into medals awarded for conquest. In parades, thousands of flags waved at once, a sea of geometry turned into spectacle. The shape dominated architecture, carved in stone so massive that even rubble would remember it. Soldiers marched beneath it, children saluted it. For a generation it became impossible to see the sign without hearing the drumbeat of war and the rhetoric of domination. The tragedy was not only that the symbol was used for violence, but that its earlier meanings were erased in the process. Most who saw it in the 1930s and 1940s no longer thought of ancient temples, of constellations, of harmony. They thought of uniforms, of shouting leaders, of endless war. What had once been sacred was now a shorthand for death. This was the final theft, not only of a sign but of memory itself. Cultures that had used the shape for centuries in art, religion, and ritual found themselves silenced, their traditions overshadowed by its new association. The mark had been poisoned, and innocence was gone. Wartime propaganda accelerated this poisoning. Posters depicted the enemy's banner as monstrous, looming over fragile cities. Films repeated the imagery until it burned into the eyes of all who watched. Cartoons mocked it, slogans cursed it, but every repetition deepened the association. The more it appeared, the stronger the theft became. Even those who hated it could not separate it from the horror unfolding across Europe and beyond. A symbol once meant to unite was now irrevocably bound to division. It is important to remember that symbols are not neutral. They live in the human imagination, and when twisted, they change the imagination itself. Soldiers painted it on aircraft wings, believing it granted power, protection, destiny. Enemies saw it and felt dread. Civilians saw it raised on conquered buildings and understood that resistance would be punished. In this way, the sign itself became a weapon, wielded not only on the battlefield, but in the mind. Wars are fought with bullets and bombs, but they are also fought with images, and this image proved devastatingly effective. As the war dragged on, the symbol grew more saturated with blood. Cities reduced to rubble bore it on their ruins, as if to remind survivors of who had done the breaking. Camps where millions perished carried it on gates and documents, branding the machinery of genocide with a geometry once carved in stone as a blessing. In those years, no prayer could reclaim it, no scholar could argue for its innocence. It had been stolen completely, turned into a mask for cruelty. Humanity's memory had been rewritten in fire. The tragedy deepened with victory. When the war finally ended and silence fell over the ruined cities, the mark did not vanish. Instead, it remained, etched in the ruins and seared into memory. It became a taboo, a forbidden shape, one that nations outlawed and survivors recoiled from. Ancient cultures that had once carried it as a sign of fertility, eternity, or good fortune were forced to hide it away, fearing it would be misunderstood. Generations to come would forget its old meanings entirely, remembering only the banners of war. It is strange to think that a shape so simple, so universal, could carry such weight. But simplicity is power in symbols. A circle, a line, a star, each can bear meanings that shift across ages. This particular sign was perhaps always vulnerable to theft because it was both ancient and immediate, familiar yet strange. To look at it was to feel it had always been known, and so, when twisted into the emblem of an empire bent on domination, it carried that uncanny familiarity into every occupied city and every terrified mind. The stolen sign also illustrates a darker truth about humanity's relationship to symbols. Once a meaning becomes dominant, it is nearly impossible to erase. Even today, when historians speak of its ancient origins, most people cannot unsee the uniforms and the parades, the camps and the ashes. The theft was too complete, too devastating. It was not only a misuse of geometry but an annihilation of memory. The war did not just destroy cities and lives, it destroyed a lineage of meaning stretching back thousands of years. And yet, perhaps, some traces survive. In quiet corners of Asia, the symbol still decorates temples carried in its older sense of balance and eternity. In archaeological collections, it still appears on pottery, textiles, and carvings, witnesses to a time before its corruption. Scholars write carefully of its history, trying to remind the world that no symbol belongs to one age alone. But the shadow of war hangs heavy, and reclaiming innocence seems almost impossible. The silence after the war was filled with rubble, mourning, and reckoning. Nations rebuilt, survivors tried to speak, and monuments were raised to memory. But in that silence, the symbol lay heavy, like a ghost that could not be exorcised. It had been too visible, too loud, too violently present to simply fade. Where once it had been traced quietly in temples or whispered in lodges, it now carried the roar of engines, the crack of rifles, the screams of crowds. Its theft was not only of shape but of sound, of feeling, of time itself. Symbols like people carry scars. The 20th century scarred this one forever. What had once been cosmic was made political. What had once been sacred was made profane. What had once united became a tool of division. In the end, the stolen sign was not only a tragedy for cultures past but a warning for cultures to come, that nothing, however ancient or innocent, is immune from being twisted by power. And so when the war ended and the world entered uneasy silence, the symbol remained in exile. Its old voices were silenced, its old meanings buried. What endured was the echo of boots on stone, the flutter of banners in the wind, the fear etched in memory. Humanity had weaponized a mark of balance and turned it into a wound that may never fully heal. The silence after war was not peace. It was mourning, not only for lives lost, but for memory stolen. The end of the wars brought rubble, silence, and the aching task of rebuilding lives. Streets once filled with parades of banners were now littered with ashes, and the emblem that had dominated those years was hurriedly erased. In the aftermath, nations passed laws forbidding its display, museums removed it from their walls, and survivors turned away from its sight as if it were poison. The symbol that had once been so visible, so omnipresent, was suddenly cast into shadow. To see it openly was to reopen wounds too fresh to bear. Yet as much as governments, institutions, and communities tried to bury it, the shape refused to vanish. Symbols do not simply disappear because we command them to. They linger, embedded in the mind, resurfacing at odd moments, haunting the very silence meant to contain them. In the decades that followed, the symbol became a paradox of memory, at once forbidden and unforgettable. For many, it could only ever summon images of tyranny, conquest, and genocide. Yet, anthropologists traveling far from Europe into deserts, mountains, and lands continued to find it painted on pottery, woven into textiles, carved into wooden posts. In villages untouched by modern wars, elders traced it as they had for centuries, speaking of balance, blessing, and cycles of time. For them, it carried no taint of the 20th century. It was as innocent as rainfall, as eternal as the stars. The dissonance between those ancient echoes and the trauma of modern memory created a tension that remains unresolved. How can one shape be both sacred and monstrous, forgotten and unforgotten at once? Psychologists began to ask deeper questions. Why did this shape recur in so many places, across so many cultures, and even after such deliberate erasure? Was it learned, passed like a story through generations, or was it born from something within the human mind itself? Some argued that its symmetry, its rhythm of lines turning upon themselves, was pleasing to the brain's pattern-seeking tendencies. Others suggested that dreams carried fragments of it, that the unconscious mind, when left to wander, returned to the shape again and again. In therapy, patients sometimes drew it without intention, sketching it as if it had slipped from memory's basement uninvited. Could it be that humanity does not merely learn symbols, but generates them, as naturally as it generates myths, music, or language? The symbol's persistence in art was perhaps the most curious. Painters, sculptors, and architects, even when avoiding it consciously, found echoes slipping into their work. Spirals bent toward its form, intersections mirrored its angles, shadows in canvases carried its ghost. Abstract artists especially seemed unable to escape it. They claimed to be inventing new geometries, but critics often saw the old sign lurking in their canvases, like a shadow refusing to be banished. In literature, too, it re-emerged, not always explicitly, but through allegory and metaphor. Stories of cycles, of wheels turning, of signs etched into forgotten manuscripts, all whispered its presence without daring to speak its name. At the same time, the effort to erase it grew more determined. Textbooks skipped over its ancient history, mentioning it only in connection with war. Archaeological exhibits avoided it, or when they did display it, placed heavy disclaimers around its case. Public memory was narrowed to a single interpretation, that of conquest and horror. But repression has its own danger. What is forbidden often becomes alluring. Underground groups, conspiracy theorists, and fringe movements began to reclaim it, not in the old sacred sense, but in ways that kept its darkness alive. The attempt to bury the symbol had succeeded only in giving it new soil to grow in, hidden from view yet never truly gone. Meanwhile, in places untouched by Western taboos, the sign continued its quiet life. In Asia, temple walls and prayer cloths carried it, unashamed, unscarred. Monks spoke of it as a wheel, a motion of the universe, a token of auspiciousness. Pilgrims traced it with reverence, lighting incense before it. Tourists, unprepared, sometimes recoiled, confused by its presence in such serene contexts. To the villagers and monks, their confusion seemed strange. Why should an old sign of eternity cause such discomfort? But to the visitors, the 20th century was still too close, the wounds too raw. Thus the symbol revealed itself as a cultural mirror. To one society it meant blessing, to another, catastrophe. It was not forgotten, yet what it meant was radically divided. Dreams too became a stage for its persistence. In accounts gathered by psychologists and anthropologists, people across cultures reported glimpses of the shape in sleep. Sometimes it appeared in mosaics on imagined walls, sometimes as turning wheels, sometimes as spirals collapsing into its form. To dream of it was often unsettling, though not always dark. Some woke with dread, others with awe, others with confusion. Was the dream shape a fragment of cultural trauma, or was it part of some deeper pattern woven into the architecture of thought? The question fascinated researchers, but offered no clear answer. As decades stretched into the late 20th century, the symbol became a ghost at the edge of culture. It surfaced in graffiti, in underground comics, in obscure academic texts. Musicians used its form in album covers, sometimes to provoke, sometimes to reclaim, sometimes without even realizing the weight it carried. Fashion flirted with it, then recoiled. Designers borrowed its angles, stripped of direct reference, creating patterns that felt familiar, yet unsettling. Even in absence, its ghost-shaped design. The forbidden had become inspiration, though always in disguise. At the same time, there were those who sought to restore its innocence. Historians traced its presence across millennia, publishing books that catalogued its appearances in ancient India, Mesopotamia, Greece, the Americas. Anthropologists wrote about its place in rituals of fertility, of harvest, of cosmic balance. Spiritual teachers urged their followers to see beyond the 20th century, to reclaim the sign as a universal mark of humanity's search for meaning. but their voices often struggled to rise above the din of taboo. Too many still recoiled, unable to see beyond the stolen century. And so the paradox deepened. The symbol was erased, yet everywhere. It was forgotten in official history, yet unforgettable in private memory. It was cursed in one hemisphere, blessed in another. It lived in dreams, in art, in unconscious sketches, in distant villages, in forbidden archives. It had become not merely a symbol, but a question about the nature of symbols themselves. Can meaning ever truly be erased? Can something so simple in geometry bear so much contradiction without breaking? Or is contradiction the very essence of what gives symbols their life? By the dawn of the 21st century, the sign had become an uneasy relic. Globalization made its paradox sharper. A.T. Traveler from Europe might encounter it in a temple in Nepal and feel shock, while the local monk saw only beauty. Online, images spread without context, sparking outrage, confusion, or fascination depending on the viewer's background. The digital age ensured that the symbol could never again be contained. It circulated endlessly, its meanings multiplying, colliding, fragmenting. It was forgotten, but only in the sense that it was no longer whole. It was remembered, but never in the same way twice. Psychologists studying the phenomenon suggested that the symbol functioned like a cultural archetype, something that springs from the shared unconscious, whether invited or not. Just as myths of floods, heroes, or underworlds recur in unconnected cultures, so too might this shape be part of a deep grammar of the mind. To see it, to dream it, to sketch it unknowingly, was to touch a root system beneath culture, beneath history. Wars could scar it, propaganda could twist it, laws could ban it, but beneath all that the mind still carried it. If so, then the question was not whether the sign could be forgotten, but whether it was even possible to forget it at all. In this sense, the symbol became a lesson about memory itself. What we try hardest to erase often lingers longest. What we bury returns in dreams, in fragments of art, in slips of the hand. The more tightly one tries to silence a memory, the more insistently it presses at the edges of thought. This shape, with its long history and tragic theft, became the perfect emblem of that paradox. Humanity had tried to silence it, but in silencing, only gave it new life. Forgotten but unforgotten, erased yet everywhere, it whispered through time. A reminder that memory is not something we control, but something that controls us. And so the whispers remain. In quiet temples, in distant villages, in dreams and in art, the shape flickers still. It carries with it every contradiction, blessing and curse, innocence and horror, eternity and ruin. To see it is to feel unease, but also recognition. It has been stolen but not destroyed. It has been forgotten but not erased. It lingers, waiting, whispering in silence. And in those whispers, one can sense the build toward conclusion, the gathering of memory into a final reckoning, when all the fragments across centuries might be gathered, and the truth of the symbol finally faced. When the dust of centuries settles, when the ruins are overgrown with grass and the banners of empires rot to threads, what remains is not stone, nor crown, nor monument, but memory. In the wake of wars and revolutions, of faiths rising and falling, one shape has traveled like a quiet traveler in the margins of history. It has been carved on temples, stitched into cloth, pressed into coins, burned onto flags, and forbidden by law. Its form has been sacred and damned, adored and despised. Now standing at the threshold of our conclusion, the question is no longer whether we can trace its history through cultures and continents. That we have done. The deeper question is why it persists at all. Why has humanity, separated by oceans, deserts and centuries, turned again and again to the same figure, as though compelled by a rhythm beneath thought? Why do the ashes of civilizations whisper the same echo? The answer is not simple. It cannot be reduced to contact between cultures or the trade of symbols along caravan routes. Such explanations have their place, yet they falter when faced with the sheer recurrence of the form. Remote tribes with no contact with the wider world etched it into their tools. Ancient civilizations separated by millennia discovered it independently. Even when societies tried to destroy it, it reemerged, drawn by the hands of children doodling in the dirt, or by dreamers sketching half-remembered visions. The persistence of the symbol suggests something deeper than diffusion. It suggests that the shape arises not from history, but from the architecture of thought itself. To understand this, we must consider the nature of the human mind. Our brains are pattern-seeking engines, restless in their hunger to impose meaning on the chaos, the world. We gaze at the stars and see constellations, at clouds and see faces, at rivers and see paths. The symbol that has haunted us is, in many ways, an extension of this drive. Its spiraling arms, its balanced symmetry, its motion within stillness, all align with the brain's craving for order and rhythm. It is not only easy to draw, it is satisfying. It feels whole. It feels inevitable. And so, even without teachers, even without ancestors passing it down, people rediscover it. It grows out of the psyche like a plant seeded in the soil of imagination. But this does not explain why it carries such weight. Patterns abound, grids, circles, triangles, and yet not all of them bear the same gravity. The symbol's power lies not just in geometry, but in resonance with something more primal. It embodies the cycle, creation and destruction, turning and returning, the eternal dance of opposites. It is the wheel that spins seasons, the spiral of galaxies, the coil of storms, the winding of rivers, the rotation of planets. To see it is to recognize in miniature the vast machinery of nature, a sign that life itself moves in rhythms beyond control. In its turning arms, people have glimpsed destiny, eternity, the breath of gods. It is not only a pattern, it is a mirror of the world's ceaseless motion. This is why cultures across time charged it with sacred meaning. For farmers, it was the wheel of harvests. For mystics, it was the turning of heavens. For warriors, it was a mark of fate. Each gave it different stories, yet all returned to the same root, the human need to anchor fear in form. To live is to confront mystery, death, the unknown, the infinite, and symbols are the bridges we build to cross those gulfs. The eternal figure, with its balance of symmetry and movement, gave a shape to what was otherwise unspeakable. It was not the same story everywhere, but the same hunger, to embody the unseen, to turn anxiety into meaning. That hunger explains why the symbol could be stolen, twisted, and made into something monstrous and yet still survive. Its geometry was too deeply tied to thought to vanish. Even when corrupted, even when turned into an emblem of destruction, it endured because its roots were older than any ideology. Nations may rise and fall, but the psyche does not change so quickly. The brain that sees order in chaos, that dreams in spirals and cycles, still calls it forth. To erase it would require erasing what it means to be human. The tragedy, of course, is that no symbol can remain pure. Every generation inherits not only the geometry, but also the memory of its uses. What was once a sign of blessing became, in the 20th century, abane of blood. To look at it now is to feel the weight of those crimes, the silence of camps, the roar of war. That shadow cannot be removed, nor should it. Symbols live in layers, and this one is layered with ash. But neither can its older meanings be fully lost. To a monk, it is still a wheel of fortune. To a villager, a mark of fertility. To a dreamer, a shape that arises unbidden in sleep. These meanings do not erase one another. They coexist, fragile, contested, unresolved. The eternal symbol is not one thing, it is all of them at once. In this way, it becomes a lesson about symbols themselves. We often think of them as static, as fixed signs pointing to single truths, but in reality, they are vessels, and vessels take the color of whatever is poured into them. The shape that began as a gesture toward eternity became a weapon, then a taboo, then a paradox. Its power lies precisely in that fluidity. It is never only itself, it is what we fear, what we hope, what we remember, what we cannot forget. Its endurance, across cultures, reveals less about geometry than about humanity. We are creatures of echo, always turning back to the same signs because the mysteries we face remain unchanged. Consider again the question, Why every culture? Why in distant deserts and jungles, mountains and islands, did people draw the same sign? The answer is not trade, not coincidence, not conspiracy. The answer is that the sign lies in the shared language of thought, the collective architecture of imagination. It is what happens when the mind reaches for form in the face of the infinite. In ashes and echoes, across temples and battlefields, the symbol is less about itself than about us. It is the shadow of our fear and the echo of our yearning, the geometry of our attempt to make peace with the unknown. As we stand in the present, the symbol is still here on temple walls, in dreams, in digital art, in forbidden archives. It lingers because it is part of the grammar of human consciousness. Its story is not finished, and perhaps it never will be. The wars gave it one meaning, the ancients another, the future will give it something new again. Each age writes its own. Layer on the sign, and in those layers we see ourselves reflected. To ask what the symbol means is to ask what we mean, and that is a question without end. And so we close not with resolution, but with recognition. The eternal symbol endures because it is bound to the eternal in us, the need to bridge the abyss of unknowing with form. It is ashes because history has burned it. It is echo because memory repeats it. It is eternal not in itself, but because the questions it embodies will never leave us. As long as humans dream, fear, wonder, and seek, the same shape will emerge again, turning through time like a wheel without rest. Forgotten yet unforgotten, cursed yet sacred, hidden yet visible, it is us written in geometry. At the end of this long journey, through deserts and temples, through monasteries and observatories, through battlefields and hidden lodges, we return to the question that first pulled us in. Why did every culture, scattered across continents and centuries, build the same symbol? Why does one form echo like a whisper in the stones of ruins, in the chants of monks, in the pages of forbidden manuscripts, and even in the graffiti of anonymous dreamers? After walking through ages of belief, terror, and rediscovery, we find ourselves not with a single answer, but with a deeper kind of mystery. The recognition that the symbol endures because it is bound not to history alone, but to the very architecture of the human mind. Across the introduction, we traced its earliest forms, scratched into caves, carved into bone, painted on pottery, placed with reverence at the heart of rituals. These earliest markings were not casual designs. They were attempts by the first, dreamers of humanity, to fix meaning to the chaos around them. The sun rose and set. Storms came and went. Life was fragile. Into this fragile order, people drew a shape that seemed to carry balance and motion at once, a geometry that felt like an answer when none could be spoken aloud. Already at the dawn of memory, the symbol was a bridge between the known and the unknowable. As civilizations rose, the same figure reappeared, dressed in new names, charged with new meanings. In Mesopotamia, it guarded temples. In India, it spun through rituals as a wheel of fortune. Among the Greeks, it danced in mosaics, a token of eternal return. The Romans adopted it casually, like a charm. Yet in each setting, it was more than decoration. It was the mark of humanity's hunger for patterns that spoke to eternity. That hunger never vanished, though empires did. When the Renaissance came, the symbol re-emerged in notebooks, in coded diagrams, in the secret gatherings of thinkers who dared to see in it more than superstition. And when the Enlightenment tried to strip mystery away with reason and measurement, the shape persisted, nonetheless showing up in the carvings of distant cultures newly encountered by explorers. Science could not erase it. Geometry could not flatten its meaning. Even telescopes, when raised to the sky, revealed spirals in the galaxies that seemed to echo the ancient form. The cosmos itself seemed to whisper back. Yet, symbols are never safe. The 19th century's fascination with secret societies gave the sign new life, only for the 20th century to twist it into horror. Here lies the darkest paradox. A shape that once stood for eternity and blessing became a banner of destruction, a mask for cruelty. For decades afterward, it seemed the figure itself had been poisoned beyond redemption. To see it was to recoil, to feel the weight of ash and blood. Humanity tried to bury it, to forget, to outlaw its return. And yet, forgetting was impossible. Anthropologists still found it in villages untouched by modern wars. Psychologists found it in the drawings of children. Artists smuggled it into their canvases. Dreamers continued to sketch it without knowing why. What history tried to erase? The mind itself restored. The symbol was not a prisoner of ideology. It was a product of the imagination's deep structures. It was older than war, older than politics, older even than language. To eradicate it would mean erasing what it means to be human. So where does that leave us? With paradox, but also with clarity. The enduring recurrence of the symbol across ages reveals something profound. That the human mind is not only a tool for survival, but a canvas for meaning. We are not content to endure the unknown. We must shape it, embody it, give it form. And so across time and place, people found themselves sketching the same geometry. It was not a coincidence, nor a conspiracy. It was an echo of thought, a natural emergence of imagination. This recognition changes how we see the symbol. It is not only a mark on stone or cloth, it is a mirror. It reflects back at us our own longing for order, our terror of chaos, our hunger for eternity. It shows us that we are pattern-making creatures and that our need for meaning drives us as surely as our need for food or shelter. To look at the figure is to look into the human condition itself. It is beautiful and it is dangerous. It carries within it both blessing and curse, for whatever we place into it, hope, fear, faith, power, becomes magnified through its enduring form. Now in the quiet of reflection, the journey resolves, not in a single truth but in layered understanding. The eternal symbol is eternal not because of its geometry, nor because of its survival in culture, but because it lives inside us. It is the image of the psyche reaching out to meet the unknown. It is the residue of awe, crystallized into shape. It is the echo of our fears and our dreams. Every time it returns, whether in temples or nightmares, it reminds us of the same truth, that humanity cannot escape its own need to give form to mystery. So we leave it here, not as an answer but as a companion. In ashes and echoes, in ruins and rebirths, the symbol endures. It belongs to no one and to everyone. It will return, as it always has, in the scratches of a child, in the chants of a mystic, in the spirals of galaxies, in the very turning of thought itself. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. Not that the symbol explains the universe, but that it explains us. It shows us that to be human is to seek, to wonder, to embody the unexplainable in lines and curves. In that act, we are infinite. The story ends, but the symbol does not. It lingers just beyond the edge of sight, waiting to be found again. Not because history insists upon it, but because the mind does. As long as we live, the form will return, an echo of eternity drawn by the hands of those who cannot help but dream. And so the mystery remains, not solved, but alive.